welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into, well, a really quite puzzling figure from Daconian history.
Yes, we've got these excerpts here from a document called Gair IV.
Right. And he became king pretty recently, relatively speaking, 456 in the High King's calendar. He was only 14.
You'd think, given that timing, we'd know a lot. But he's mostly remembered by this rather blunt nickname, Gair the Large.
Yeah, Gair the Large. It's quite the contrast, isn't it? A recent king, but shrouded in mystery.
Exactly. So in this deep dive, we want to sift through what little we do know about his life, his reign.
And maybe try to figure out why there's so little information. It's strange.
It is. And that image we have of him, this huge figure, it's sort of our entry point into this whole historical puzzle.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. His ascension. 14 years old, and the text mentions a brief yet grievous contention for the crown.
So right away, you've got instability. A kid taking the throne in that situation, it sets a certain tone.
Definitely. And because he was so young, everyone expected his mother, Lady Beth Rice of House Dorisina.
A very prominent house.
Right. Everyone assumed she'd be regent. And the text says the plan was for her to rule until Gair turned 15 the next autumn. Standard procedure, really.
That was the standard, yes. But it seems that's not quite how it went down.
No. The document says she kept governing for many a year. And the reason, just sundry reasons unknown to common folk.
Which is incredibly vague, isn't it?
It really is. It makes you ask, well, what were these reasons? Was Gair somehow unfit, or did his mother just not want to let go of the reins?
It certainly hints at something happening behind the scenes, this extended regency, these unspecified reasons. It's the first big red flag that things weren't exactly normal with Gair's early reign.
Kept from the public, perhaps deliberately.
Possibly.
Bizarre.
Suggests secrecy, maybe even some kind of controversy around him right from the start.
And then we get to the thing he is known for. His size. Prodigious size, the text calls it. Over 500 pounds.
Wow. That is specific.
It's incredibly specific. And it creates this really stark contrast with the almost complete lack of information about anything else he did. A huge physical presence, but a historical non-entity almost.
It paints a very vivid picture, though, this enormous man. And yet the chronicles just go silent on his actions, his words, his personality.
And the text mentions he was reclusive, rarely seen.
Yeah, rarely seen by the public. And apparently, whenever he was seen, he was always with his veterinary advisors.
Ah, the veterinary. Let's talk about them for a second. This specific caste, always in white, seen as the purest.
Right, with all those restrictions, no property, no trade, no meat or alcohol. But often used as advisors, scholars. People thought they were inherently honest.
So surrounding the king with them, it feels intentional, like maybe they were there to guide him, or maybe manage him, control the story.
Well, what's really telling is that the document notes the veterinary tried to get him known as Gair the Pious.
Gair the Pious. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it strongly suggests a PR campaign, almost. An attempt to shape his image, maybe counteract the large aspect or project some kind of moral authority he wasn't showing himself.
And he was kept inside Chrysalis, this royal place, after becoming king.
Seems so. It adds to this picture of isolation, doesn't it?
It really does. It makes him seem like, well, like a figurehead, maybe managed by his mother and these advisors, kept away. Because, I mean, think about what kings usually did back then.
Leading armies.
Yeah, leading armies, making big pronouncements, building things.
Grand projects, decrees.
Exactly. And for Gair, the record shows nothing. No account of battles commanded, no record of decrees proclaimed, no mention of grand construction projects. It's genuinely weird.
It is weird. Those are the building blocks of history for a ruler. For them to be completely absent, it suggests either he did absolutely nothing of note or someone did a very good job of erasing whatever he did do.
Even the basics are missing. The text admits it offers but scant tales of his life, his speech, and his unions.
We barely know anything personal about him.
And just to highlight how strange this is, the document points to the archons of Evelier, rulers from centuries earlier.
Right, much earlier, before 180 HKC, when Evelier's libraries got trashed by trolls and rebels.
Even with that destruction, we still have bits and pieces about them from other cities' records, like
Raphael the Wise restoring the Basilica Faecilica.
Right.
Queen Karanis building the sewers in Urish.
Yeah. Even that odd story about Raol moving vermin between cities, we have these little details about ancient rulers.
But for Gair IV, who ruled much more recently, almost silence. It really drives home how unusual this lack of information is. Was it just a quiet reign? Or was something actively suppressing his history?
Well, then there's another twist. The document says his reign wasn't quiet at all for the kingdom. It describes the time as one where the world around him surged with discord and woe.
So not peaceful times. There was trouble brewing.
Exactly, significant turmoil. But Gair himself, he's described as being in tranquil stillness, like a steadfast rock amidst a stormy sea.
A rock. Passive.
Yeah, and crucially, it says he neither caused the suffering nor did anything to stop it. That's quite an indictment, really.
It is. It suggests a detachment, doesn't it? Whether that was wisdom or apathy or maybe just a result of being kept isolated by, his mother and the Ventinari, we don't know. His serene detachment is open to interpretation.
And even the person writing this document seems kind of thrown by it. It ends that section apologetically, saying how little is known about Gair.
To say that he was indeed large.
Right. It's almost darkly funny in its bluntness, but it really highlights the core mystery we're dealing with.
Absolutely. So let's just recap. We've got this king, Gair IV, physically huge, rules in the mid-400s HKC, so not ancient history.
Should be well documented.
Should be. But he's incredibly poorly documented. Way less than rulers centuries before him. He seems passive, maybe confined, definitely managed.
All while the kingdom around him is apparently in turmoil, discord, and woe.
Exactly. He's this paradox.
Yeah.
A massive yet inactive ruler in very troubled times.
It really leaves you, the listener, thinking, doesn't it? What could possibly explain this massive gap in the records? Was it deliberate erasure?
Were those sundry reasons for his mother's long regency somehow connected to keeping him and his reign quiet?
And the Ventinari advisors, what was their real role? Were they shaping his legacy or just burying it?
So many questions. Gair the Large remains mostly in the shadows, and that very obscurity, that lack of information, becomes the most fascinating thing about him.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're venturing into the story of Lady Bethrice Doricina. She's a figure who really, completely defied expectation.
Right. I mean, picture this woman tiny, really.
Yeah. Small in stature, barely 4.5 feet tall, apparently.
But she somehow rose to become, the dominant force in Daconia.
And this is all happening after the First Antler War, which, as you might remember from our previous look, was a time of real crisis, left the kingdom pretty vulnerable.
Exactly. And it's out of that instability that Lady Bethrice emerges. So our focus today, and we're drawing from a pretty detailed account of her life, her family, her character.
Right.
Is really to get to the core of her initial power. How did someone who seemed, physically quite delicate, command so much respect and navigate these pretty formidable challenges?
Yeah, what were the key things she had going for her early on?
What were those levers of influence?
Precisely. So our mission here is to kind of dissect the critical factors that pushed Bethrice into prominence and also look at the obstacle she had to get past. We want to give you a really clear understanding of this fascinating historical figure and the intricate power dynamics playing out in Daconia.
Okay, so where do we start? Her origins, I suppose.
Yeah, let's begin there. It's a vital first step.
Okay, so Bethrice's background was, anything but ordinary. Her father was Duke Courtier d'Ors and de Voltaire.
Described in our source as the most puissant lord in the land. That sounds important.
It absolutely was. Now, Voltaire itself, it's characterized as a barren and treacherous domain.
Doesn't sound too inviting.
No, but that description actually hints at its crucial strategic significance.
Okay. How so?
Well, Voltaire was basically the essential conduit for trade, wasn't it? It connected the Tyrosi kingdoms to the east with Gwenendorn way out west.
Okay, so like a bottleneck. A gateway.
Exactly. Think of it as this heavily guarded gateway. All these high-repute, valuable goods flowed through it into Daconia and beyond.
Right. So here's a key takeaway right away, isn't it? Bethrice wasn't just born into wealth.
No.
She was born into a family that controlled like a vital artery of the entire kingdom's economy.
Yeah, and here's where it gets really interesting. The specific source of Duke Courtier's massive wealth.
Go on.
So beyond just controlling this trade route, he had this ancient deal with the crown.
An agreement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because he was the warden responsible for keeping the paths through Harpy's Pass safe.
Harpy's Pass? Sounds charming.
Right. His job was protecting travelers from basilisks and harpies. Seriously.
Basilisks and harpies, you're kidding.
Nope. And because of that duty, he was granted a full third of all the tolls collected there.
A third. Just for keeping monsters away. Wow.
It sounds like something out of a legend, yeah. But it had very real, very significant financial consequences.
I'll bet. That must have made him unbelievably rich.
Pretty much the wealthiest man in Daconia. Maybe even, in all of Kaela.
Incredible. So Beth Reese's family wasn't just noble, they were exceptionally rich and deeply influential because of this.
Definitely. But it's important to get the full picture of Voltaire itself. There were these stark contrasts.
How do you mean?
Well, despite this immense wealth coming from trade and tolls, the land itself was harsh, really unforgiving.
Okay.
And it bred a population known for being, stern, disciplined, hardworking.
You can see that in their farming too, right?
Exactly. Even their agriculture tells this story. So the northern parts, around Lake Dovais, they were more fertile, grew things like tomatoes, cucumbers, melons.
Familiar stuff.
Right. But the south, much more arid, really dry.
And that's where the spicy chilies came in.
That's it. These intensely fiery chilies grown on cacti.
The cacti, seriously.
Yeah, and they used them to, spice up their cheese.
Wow. Talk about a unique regional identity forged by the land. Okay, so that paints a real picture of her background. Powerful, wealthy, but also kind of rugged and tough.
A place of both great affluence and considerable hardship.
So what about her early life, her upbringing in this environment?
Well, our source mentions that Duke Courtier married quite late in life. After he got back from the wars in Leor,
Okay.
he became marshal in 420 HKC. That's historical king's calendar.
Got it.
And Beth Rice was born just 2 years later, 422 HKC.
Where did she grow up, primarily?
Mostly in the Red Fortress of Castron. Though they apparently visited Guaros quite often. That was a major city nearby, just over the Doran Stream.
Okay. And the Dorizans, they had a reputation for being secretive, right? But we do know some things about her education.
We do, surprisingly. It seems she was remarkably multilingual, fluent in Daconian, Octree, Avini.
And Gwenendori, too.
And Gwenendori, yes. Which is, pretty impressive command of languages for that time.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just languages, was it? Her education was broader than that.
Oh, absolutely. It was comprehensive. Covered law, lore, theology.
The serious stuff.
Right. But also the more refined arts, like song and dance. She's described as having a radiant intellect and gentle spirit, and a soft, pleasing voice. Suggests she was, cultivated to be both really knowledgeable and exceptionally charming.
Okay, so we're building this picture. Intelligent, highly educated woman, powerful family, immense wealth. Seems like she was set up for a prominent position.
You'd think so. And indeed, she was betrothed to Ionin.
King Gair III's eldest son. That's a huge match, politically speaking.
Massive, without a doubt. Their union produced twin daughters in 439 HKC.
Twins, okay.
And then their son, Gair, was born in 441 HKC.
Right.
But interestingly, Gair wasn't born in, the Daconian heartlands. He was born in El Brior, over in Leor.
Why Leor?
Well, it seems it was right after an assassination attempt back into Curiate. Beth Rice was actually wounded in that attack.
Wounded? Good grief, where?
The source mentions her breast. It really underscores just how precarious the political climate was.
It certainly does. And Leor itself, that place had its own history of instability, didn't it? Needed Daconian intervention before.
Exactly. It highlights the existing power dynamics and kind of sets the stage for Beth Rice's later involvement there with her husband.
So even the birth of a future king is wrapped up in violence and political maneuvering.
Shadowed by it. And then, tragedy strikes not long after.
Ah, yes. Ionin, her husband.
Sadly, yes. He was killed, ambushed near Monacy in Leor.
Oh, no. So soon after Gair was born.
Yeah. Which meant that young Gair became crown prince, basically from birth.
But the danger wasn't over for them, was it? For Beth Rice and her son?
Far from it. No, it actually escalated dramatically.
Yeah.
And from within the royal family itself.
Queen Dionyse, King Gair III's consort.
Yes. She apparently attempted to murder young Gair, her own grandchild, when he was only 3 years old.
3. Tried to kill her own 3-year-old grandson.
What does that tell you about the Daconian court at that time?
Just sheer ruthlessness, right? Paranoia. For a queen to plot against her own line like that, it just shows the extreme ambition, the lengths people would go to for power.
Terrifying. And this forced Beth Rice's hand, completely. She had to take desperate measures. She was forced to flee, took her son, and ran back to Voltaire, her home turf.
Just imagine the fear, the urgency of that escape. Wow. Okay, so before we get into her flight and how she eventually comes back, the source gives us a bit more on Beth Rice herself, right? Her appearance, her character.
Yes, and these details are pretty significant, especially when you think about how people saw her initially.
Okay.
Physically, she was described as not of great stature. Remember, only 4'8".
Tiny.
Very. And delicate in form, elfin in appearance. Apparently, this likely came from her mother's side, House Eannarin. They were known for being smaller.
It's fascinating how often you see that in history, isn't it? People achieving great things despite, or maybe even because of, seeming physical limitations.
And Queen Dionysus certainly misjudged her based on that. There's this famous story.
Oh, yeah.
When they first met, Dionysus apparently mistook Bethrice for a young maidservant.
No.
Yes. Called her sweet mouse, condescendingly. Said she was small like a doll and shy like a kitten.
Wow. Patronizing much.
Totally. And even offered to take her under my wings. The irony, given what happened later, it's just staggering.
Astounding. That initial misjudgment, though, it's a powerful lesson, isn't it? Never underestimate someone based on how they look, especially non-politics.
A recurring theme, definitely.
Right.
The dramatic ironies, just so thick you could cut it. Dionysus' dismissive words completely missed the inner strength, the determination, the strategic mind Bethrice clearly had.
Qualities that would become very obvious later on.
Undeniably. The source specifically points out Bethrice's courage in protecting her son, a total contrast to how Diane saw her.
Okay, so we have this physically small, maybe initially underestimated, but clearly very resolute woman, forced into exile to protect her child. What happens next? How does she go from being a fugitive to, well, the most powerful woman in Daconia?
Okay, so the next chapter really begins with her return to the capital, Chrysalis, in 442 HKC.
Right?
She brings the remains of her husband, Ionin, back with her.
Must have been incredibly difficult.
Understandably, yeah. She entered this period of deep mourning, melancholy, and Queen Dionysus, well, she outwardly seems supportive.
Oh, trying to look good. Or keep an eye on her.
Probably a bit of both. Maybe
Yeah.
trying to quiet any suspicion, offered help to Bethrice and young Gair. But behind the scenes, Bethrice was already planning, thinking long-term.
How long term?
An 11-year strategy, it turns out.
11 years. Wow.
Yep. 2 years after she got back, she pulls off this incredible deception. She publicly announces that her young son, Gair, has died.
Faked his death.
Faked his death. And secretly smuggled him back to Voltaire, back to safety.
Unbelievable.
Then she followed him there and lived in secrecy in Castron for over a decade.
11 years.
That level of planning,
Yeah.
that dedication to keeping him safe, it's extraordinary.
It really speaks volumes, doesn't it? About her intelligence, her meticulous planning, and just how well she understood the danger Dionysus posed.
So she's in hiding for 11 years. Then what? How does she come back? Her reemergence. It happens in 455 HKC at the Basilica of Sage Laurent, right there in Chrysalis, a major public place, during a significant gathering.
Okay, setting the stage.
Exactly. And there, she reveals the truth, tells everyone about the attempted assassination on her son all those years ago.
After all that time in silence, people must have been stunned. Did they believe her?
They did, largely. Several key things worked in her favor.
Like what?
Well, first, Queen Dionysus already had this reputation for being harsh, ruthless even. She came from House Taufen, known for being pretty brutal.
Okay, so Dionysus wasn't exactly popular?
Not universally, no. And in contrast, Bethrice had cultivated this image, this reputation for kindness, for being gentle.
So a clear contrast in public perception.
Right. And crucially, Bethrice also secured the backing of some really influential figures, like Matriarch Naiades of Chrysalis. Her support carried a lot of weight.
Ah, powerful allies. That makes sense. It wasn't just Bethrice's word against the queens, then.
Exactly. There was this growing wave of public feeling, plus these powerful endorsements.
And this leads to the sanctuary movement, right?
Precisely. A whole bunch of women, particularly in Chrysalis, rallied around Bethrice. They formed the sanctuary movement specifically to protect her and Prince Gair.
So directly opposing Dionysus' own son, Torian, the one she presumably wanted on the throne.
Directly opposing Torian's claim, yeah. This popular uprising became a serious threat to Dionysus' power.
And Dionysus, she didn't handle it well, did she? Made a critical mistake.
A fatal one, really. She responded with force.
Ow.
Fearing this growing unrest, she called on her own family, the Tophans, to basically seize control of Chrysalis and violently crush the sanctuary movement.
Oof, bad move.
Disastrous, totally backfired. Instead of crushing the opposition, it just alienated everybody. The general population and maybe more importantly, the powerful lords of the realm.
They didn't like the heavy-handed approach.
Not at all. They withdrew their support from Torian and instead threw their weight behind Gair, Bethrice's son, as the legitimate heir.
So Dionysus' attempt to use brute force was the final nail in her coffin.
Pretty much. It led directly to her downfall and her sons.
What happened to them?
Torian and Dionysus were overthrown and subsequently killed. The whole house of Taufen was scattered.
Wow.
And in the early part of 456 HKC, with them out of the picture, Beth Rice basically stepped into that power vacuum. She became the most influential figure in all of Daconia.
From being dismissed as a sweet mouse to the most powerful lady in the kingdom. What an incredible, dramatic rise.
It really is extraordinary.
So, okay, looking back at this whole journey, we've seen her go from this well-connected but seemingly fragile young woman into the absolute center of power. And it happened through this series of really dangerous events, fueled by, well, by danger itself, but also her own courage and some seriously impressive strategic thinking.
Definitely. And if we try to boil down the essential takeaways from her story, a few key themes really stand out, don't they?
Yeah, what would you say they are?
Well, first, you absolutely cannot deny the significance of family ties and resources. Her father's wealth, his strategic control, that was a vital foundation.
True. Money and connections mattered.
Immensely.
Yeah.
Second, you see the ever-present instability around succession, how volatile it can be, and the extreme things people will do in that pursuit of power.
Like trying to kill your own grandchild.
Exactly. But maybe the most powerful theme here is how personal character, or at least the perception of it, can sway everything.
You mean the kindness versus ruthlessness thing?
Right. How Beth Rice's reputation for kindness, contrasted with Dionysus' perceived harshness, profoundly influenced public opinion and ultimately completely reshaped the political landscape.
Yeah, that initial underestimation of Beth Rice.
Compared to her ultimate impact.
It's a really compelling insight. That condescension from Dionysus at the start just perfectly highlights how deceptive looks can be.
And how dangerous it is to underestimate someone, especially in the high-stakes game of royal politics.
Absolutely.
Which kind of leads us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe chew on.
Okay.
How might Beth Rice's long time in secrecy, those 11 years hiding in Voltaire, how might that have shaped her later on when she was actually governing?
Good question.
You know, emerging after more than a decade, essentially, in the shadows, having pulled off this incredibly complex, risky plan. What kind of ruler does that make you?
Yeah, would she be more cautious, more ruthless herself, maybe?
Right. And how might that unique experience have played into the eventual wane of her initial widespread adoration? The source hints that her popularity didn't last forever.
Ah, interesting. So the very thing that brought her to power might have contained the seeds of, well, something else later on.
Exactly. It's a fascinating question to ponder, isn't it? The long-term ripples of these dramatic early events.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into a really critical time for Daconia.
Yeah, the period right after the First Antler War. We're looking at how the Royal Council got formed under Regent Beth Rice Dorycina.
Exactly. And our main source here is chapter2.pdf. It gives a great look at the start of King Gair V's reign, he was just a kid, and how his mother, Beth Rice, navigated things.
It was a super turbulent time. I mean, the Taufen uprising had just ended, technically, but it left things really fractured.
And then you had the death of Torian V, a big player.
Huge. And his supporters were still around, creating a lot of underlying tension. Beth Rice had a massive job in her hands.
Absolutely. So a 14-year-old king, a divided kingdom, Torian's loyalists lurking. Our mission for this deep dive is figuring out how Beth Rice put together her royal council. Who did she pick? Why?
And there's some surprising personal stuff tangled up in all this political maneuvering, too.
Right. Okay, so first things first. How did she start consolidating power? What was the opening gambit?
Well, her very first big appointment was pretty inspired, actually. She named her own father, Duke Courtier de Wierzin of Voltaire, as Marshal of Daconian forces.
Her father. Okay. Marshal and hegemon of the Western Arconate. That sounds important.
It was crucial. The Western Arconate, that included Lior, was really vulnerable after the uprising. And Courtier, he was a known quantity, a respected military leader. This move directly addressed the instability out west, particularly in Lior.
So plugging a major gap right away. But wait, Torian Viperidae had been marshal before he died, right? What about his troops? Weren't they stationed somewhere?
Good point. Yes, he had about 4,000 soldiers down in Faisilico. And they were, understandably, a bit wary. You know, a new young king, a new marshal.
So Courtier had to win them over.
He did. He summoned their commanders to Chrysalis. His argument was pretty straightforward, actually. He basically said, look, one ruler can't effectively run the kingdom and lead a war effort simultaneously, especially not a young one. And he committed to leading the Leor campaign himself. He even announced that Orgolian V. Talfin and his sons, get this, the very people Torian had kind of opposed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they'd be joining him, Leor. It was a clear signal about moving forward, focusing on the external threat.
How did that go down with the commanders? Torian was their guy.
Apparently, it went surprisingly well. They respected Torian, sure, but Cordiar, he had this pre-existing reputation from earlier in his career, especially for logistics.
Logistics, like supplies and stuff.
Exactly. Keeping the army fed, equipped, moving, the stuff that actually wins campaigns. That practical side seemed to have really resonated with the commanders. They knew he could get the job done.
Okay, so they were practical guys. Reputation for competence matters.
It really does. And Cordiar didn't just talk the talk. He spent about a month in Chrysalis getting things organized, resupplying, yes, but also retiring some older soldiers and commissioning new ones.
New ones from Voltai, his home duchy, I bet.
Likely, yeah, smart move. Consolidated his control before he even left for Leor, which freed Bethrace up to focus on building the rest of her council.
Right, the political side. So who was next?
Amaris. She appointed Amaris as chancellor.
Amaris. Okay, tell me about her.
She was a respected scholar of law, studied at the University of Vivaldi, so her focus was clearly on the judicial side, restoring order, getting the legal system back on track after all the chaos.
Which sounds like exactly what was needed. And it complements Bethrace, doesn't it? Because Bethrace's strengths were more in, like, foreign policy.
Precisely. Bethrace was known for her diplomatic skills, fluent in several languages. The source even uses this great analogy, comparing her to the previous regent candidate, Diane Nice. It says Bethrace was like a bowl of warm milk to a block of iron.
Huh. Okay, so a different style, more conciliatory maybe.
Seems that way. A different approach, definitely.
Yeah.
Then, for head and former, basically spy master, she appointed Iran V. Raquerel.
Iran Raquerel. Any notable connections?
Yes, he was linked to Duchess Curis of Ophiria. Ophiria was a pretty powerful region, so that connection likely helped Bethrace shore up support and influence.
Okay, leveraging existing power bases. Smart. Yeah. What was his immediate job?
Keeping the peace in Chrysalis itself. After the uprising, things were still messy. Some of the Talfin supporters hadn't just faded away. They'd formed gangs, causing trouble.
So internal security was still a big issue.
Definitely. And Iran used the Skydnai Riders for that.
The female knights. Illyris's order.
That's them. And they were apparently incredibly effective and popular. The source mentions people chanting Illyris in the taverns.
Really?
Yeah, hailing them as heroes for clearing out the quote is Talfin Tankard Knights.
Talfin Tankard Knights. Love it. So the Skydnairs were seen as liberators in the city.
Absolutely. You get a real sense of public relief. But then came a tricky one. The treasurer.
Tricky how? Finding someone qualified.
Not just qualified. This is where the personal drama really kicks in. Bethrace wanted someone connected to Valcaire V. Chambroise, a kinswoman of his.
Valcaire V. Chambroise. Why him specifically?
Well, it seems strategic, but the problem was Valcaire himself. He was deep in mourning. His grandson had been executed for his role in the uprising.
Oh, right. That's heavy.
And to complicate it further, Torian Vipiero, the dead marshal, was Valcaire's son-in-law. So Valcaire felt this deep sense of loss, maybe even betrayal, surrounding the whole situation. He wasn't exactly receptive.
Understood. So Bethrace couldn't just summon him. What did she do?
She went to him, traveled to Castle Melisel herself in the summer of 456.
Okay, a personal touch. How was she received?
Not well, at least not initially. Her own daughter, Sophris V. Pirade, confronted her.
Wait, Bethrace's daughter, why is she hostile?
Well, Sophris had her own complicated history. Her son's father was Gair V. Talfin, one of the main rebels, and she'd apparently supported Dianis, Bethrace's rival. So you have all these tangled loyalties and past grievances boiling over.
Wow. So what happened?
Sophris was furious, accused Bethrace, and then actually struck her, hit the regent.
She hit her own mother, the regent. Good grief. Did she apologize?
Nope. Refused point blank. According to the source, she said something like, a Talfin would rather be whipped than offer an apology. Shows how deep that pride and resentment ran.
Incredible. Was anyone else there?
Lady Talys apparently stepped in, tried to smooth things over. Suggests maybe not everyone in that household felt quite as intensely as Sophris.
Okay, so a very rough start. Did Bethrace eventually get to speak with Valcaire?
She did. And her approach seems quite gentle, actually. Expressed condolences for his grandson, Amer, She even said she might have considered more pardons if things had been different.
Trying to build a bridge.
Seems like it. She also pointed out she'd intervened to protect Torian's other children, the ones he had with Obrois, Valkair's daughter, trying to show she wasn't acting purely out of vengeance.
And Obrois. She was Torian's widow, right? How was she doing?
Deep in grief, as you'd expect, locked herself away. And this is where Beth Rice does something really unexpected.
What?
She sits outside Obrois's locked door for 7 days.
7 days, just sitting there.
Just sitting there. Obrois is apparently shouting insults, venting all her grief and anger at her, and Beth Rice just takes it. Patiently asks again and again if she's finished, if it's easing her heart at all.
Wow, that's not typical diplomacy. That's intense empathy. Or maybe stubbornness.
Maybe a bit of both, but it worked. After 7 days, Obrois apparently breaks down and begs Beth Rice not to leave her alone.
Incredible. What a turning point.
Yeah. It shows this amazing capacity Beth Rice had for, well, enduring emotional hardship to reach someone. After that, they started talking, walking together in Melisel, reconnecting.
So the ice finally broke, and then came the job offer.
Then came the job offer. Yeah. Beth Rice asks Obrois, Torian's widow, Valkair's daughter, to be royal treasurer.
From deep grief to a key council position, did she accept?
She did. And this is but she had a condition.
Ah, there's always a catch. What was it?
She wanted her daughter, Nimprice, who was also Torian's daughter, sister to the executed Emir, betrothed to King Gair IV.
A royal marriage. To heal the rift with House Perid.
Exactly. A very political move, using marriage to bring peace or at least attempt reconciliation within that powerful family.
Was that even allowed? They were first cousins, right? Gair and Nimprice?
Yes, but the source notes that Voltaine and Lior custom actually permitted first cousin marriage. It just needed the approval of the matriarch of Chrysalis.
So they found a justification within existing traditions. Clever. Using culture for political ends.
Very much so. It wasn't just emotional. It was framed within their societal rules. And with Obrois accepting, Beth Rice essentially had her core council.
Right. So Cordia for the military, Amrice for law, Aaron for intelligence, and now Obrois managing the finances, all under Beth Rice's regency. How long did that regency last again?
12 years, according to the source. A long time for her to shape things.
12 formative years indeed. It's quite a story navigating all that political danger and deep personal pain.
It really is.
Yeah.
I think the key things for you, the listener, to take away are, 1, how strategically Beth Rice made those appointments, balancing skill and loyalty, and 2, her willingness to get right into the messy personal stuff, the grief, the anger.
Yeah, she didn't shy away from the human element, did she? Confronting Valkair's grief, enduring Sophris's anger, that whole 7 days outside Obrois's door.
Exactly. It shows that running a kingdom isn't just about power plays. It's about dealing with people, with all their history and emotions.
And the surprising bits really stand out. That unconventional approach with Obrois and how a marriage proposal essentially sealed the deal for the treasury position. It's much more complex than just a list of appointments.
Absolutely. It makes you think about how much these personal connections, these old wounds and loyalties really steer the ship of state, you know?
Definitely. So here's something for you to chew on. How much do personal histories and relationships truly dictate political outcomes? And thinking about that proposed marriage between Nimrice and Gareth IV, given all the bad blood and tragedy tied to House Pered and the Taufins, what kind of long-term effects might that union have had on Daconia? Lots to think about there. Imagine a society just reeling from a huge upheaval, you know. Everything's shaken up and someone has to step in and try to put the pieces back together.
That's pretty much the scene we're diving into today.
Yeah, we're looking deep into the first few years of Beth Rice's regency over in Daconia. Specifically that period, what was it, 456 to 460 HKC?
That's right, according to their calendar.
Mm-hmm.
And this is immediately following the Taufin uprising, which, well, it left the realm in a really fragile state.
Exactly. And for digging into this, our main source is excerpts from chapter 3.pdf. It's called The Chronicle of Beth Rice's Regency, the Early Years, 456, 460 HKC.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission today, we really want to pull out the key things Beth Rice did right at the start and, you know, get a feel for the impact she had trying to rebuild Daconia.
Yeah, understand her initial moves as regent for her son, Gair IV.
Right. And for those of you listening who want to get a solid grasp of this period, maybe without wading through dense texts yourself, well, we think this deep dive will give you a clear and hopefully engaging overview.
Let's get into it.
Okay.
So the Chronicle kicks off basically saying Beth Rice's first priority was, well, restoring peace and dignity. Makes sense after the uprising.
It really does. And her first actions seem very tangible, like physical rebuilding.
Yeah, she apparently decreed that Chrysalis, the main city, had to be rebuilt.
And using specific materials, right? Red bricks from Voltaire.
Exactly. Red bricks. And it even mentions Voltaire masons crafting them.
That's interesting. It gives you this like vivid picture of the city changing, becoming red brick everywhere, a very visible sign of something new.
It does suggest wanting something solid, permanent maybe. And choosing those specific bricks, those masons, it feels deliberate. Like a statement about quality or a fresh start, perhaps.
Yeah, breaking from the immediate past.
And alongside that, there's this focus on spiritual rebuilding, too. Building new shrines.
Right, shrines to the sages Ifer and Varara.
And the Chronicle highlights the shrine of Sage Riara as being particularly significant for Beth Rice.
It wasn't just a religious site, was it? She turned it into something more.
That's right. It became a sanctuary, specifically for women in difficult situations.
Like, one part for elderly women who didn't have family support?
Yes. And another wing for mothers with young children, maybe widows or women who've been outcast for some reason. Wow. That's quite a direct social program built right into a religious space. Shows a certain kind of compassion.
It really does. It points towards maybe a social conscience underpinning some of her early policies.
Okay.
And this concern seems to extend to her tackling what the Chronicle calls vices in Chrysalis, particularly the brothels.
Ah, right, the brothels. So what was her approach there? Did she just shut them all down?
Interestingly, no, not entirely. It was more about regulation, heavy regulation.
Okay, like what?
Well, for starters, no strong drink allowed inside. And they couldn't be located right next to taverns.
Separating the two vices, maybe?
Perhaps. And then there's the financial angle. Brothel keepers had to hand over half their earnings to the crown.
Half. That's steep. Where did that money go? The Chronicle is specific. It was earmarked for orphans and that women's sanctuary at the house of Sage Viara.
Okay, so she's trying to control it, reduce its influence, and funnel the proceeds towards causes she supports. That's complex.
It's definitely a multi-pronged strategy, trying to curb the activity but also using its existence to fund social welfare. You can see how that might have, well, complicated effects.
And did it reduce the number of them?
Oh, yes. Significantly. The text says only 8 were allowed to remain, and those 8 were watched constantly by the City Watch.
Under scrutiny.
Very much so. Plus, there was the mandatory registration for the women working there.
And the red scarves. That's probably the most famous part of this policy.
It is, a very visible marker. According to the Chronicle, Beth Rice's intent was clearly to, well, shame them.
Shame the women or the men visiting, or both.
The text implies both, but perhaps especially aimed at discouraging men of standing the Amatiniaro, the nobility, from frequenting these places. Make it too public, too visible.
But humans are adaptable, aren't they? There's that mention of the Red Lady establishment.
Ah, yes. Situated near the more privileged quarters.
And apparently the scarves there were made of much finer material.
Indeed. Which kind of subverts the whole shame aspect, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Or at least creates a class distinction within the system she created.
Yeah, it suggests the elite found a way to navigate it, maybe even make it a status symbol in a twisted way.
It's possible. And Beth Rice reacted to that too, didn't she?
She did. She banned Amatiniaro, known to frequent the Red Lady, from even entering the castle.
Wow. So her social reforms are directly impacting the court and the nobility around her.
It really shows how hard it is to just impose a moral code from the top down, right?
Absolutely. Her intentions might seem clear from one perspective, but how people react, how society adapts, it's never straightforward. The policy ends up highlighting existing class divides rather than just enforcing morality.
Yeah, those unintended consequences. So beyond these big decrees, the Chronicle also suggests Beth Rice tried to connect with ordinary people more personally.
Yes, it mentions her being seen out and about in Chrysalis quite often.
Doing what?
Visiting sacred places, apparently just for quiet reflection, and listening to sacred chants in the easy tongue.
The easy tongue? That sounds ancient. Were these chants important? You mentioned the Loi and Dii.
Ah, yes. The Loi and Dii were, well, very foundational figures in Daconic belief, ancestral spirits, some might say minor deities. So chants in that ancient easy tongue connected to them would have carried a lot of spiritual weight.
Okay, so her presence at these things wasn't just casual.
Likely not. And her visits to the Viera sanctuary weren't just symbolic either.
Right, the Chronicle says she actually served soup in the cantina.
Yes, and interacted with the children there.
And the detail about her clothes, wearing simple stuff, nothing fancier than a respectable Amatiniara. Who were the Amatiniara again? Exactly.
They were the nobility, the upper class.
Mm-hmm.
So by dressing like a respectable one, but not extravagantly, she's sort of positioning herself. Not quite common, but not overly regal or detached either. Projecting humility, maybe?
Trying to seem relatable, perhaps.
Could be, and reinforcing that image. She did that public auction, didn't she?
Oh, yeah, selling off the silver chests and tapestries her predecessor, Dionysus, had collected.
A very public display of reducing court spending, and maybe a subtle dig at Dionysus' tastes or spending habits.
Definitely sends a message about fiscal responsibility, or at least the appearance of it, aligning herself with a more frugal image.
Exactly, a populist touch, maybe.
It's interesting, though, her focus on morality wasn't just about brothels and spending. It extended to culture, too.
Apparently so. The Chronicle notes she really disliked the popular nightly romances of the day.
Why? What was wrong with them?
She saw them as morally corrupting, full of, promiscuity, jealousy, glorifying deeds that she felt should be condemned. Basically, bad influences.
So what did she want people reading instead? Especially young women.
She encouraged them to study the Holy Scriptures, the Terra Oracula, and the traditional lore of the land.
Mm-hmm.
More wholesome, traditional knowledge.
So she's trying to shape behavior, social structures, and the cultural mindset. It's quite ambitious.
Extremely. Rebuilding, reforming, connecting, guiding morals. Stuff a lot.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it? The Chronicle mentions pushback.
Not at all. While it says she gained respect from some groups, particularly Amatiniari women, and many Nimestra, who were basically commoner women, there's also growing resentment.
Resentment from who?
Well, it names Raisin Ann of the Table, a poet.
Okay.
He apparently wrote ballads mocking her, specifically targeting her strict policies and, crucially, the high taxes on alcohol.
Ah, the taxes. That often causes trouble. What exactly did she tax?
Pretty much all strong drink got hit with a heavy new toll. 1 silver and 30 copper coins per barrel, the text says.
That sounds like a lot.
It likely was for many, though interestingly there was an exception. Lefris diaphragm wine was exempt from this higher toll.
Lefrace diaphragm wine. Any idea why? Was it connected to powerful people or maybe just not a common drink?
The Chronicle doesn't explicitly say, but either of those is plausible. Maybe it was produced by allies, or perhaps it wasn't the drink of the masses, so taxing it wouldn't cause as much grumbling.
Right. And besides the tax, she also made taverns close early.
Yes, 1 hour before midnight. Another restriction on daily life and business.
You can definitely see how tavern keepers and their patrons would get annoyed. High taxes, less time to sell.
Precisely. And the Chronicle suggests the predictable consequences followed.
Which were?
Honest tavern owners struggled. Some went out of business entirely. And naturally, a black market popped up. Smuggling, illicit brewing.
Filling the gap left by the legal trade. Classic response to heavy regulation or taxation.
Exactly. So these things, the taxes, the rules, the perceived moralizing, they started to wear thin.
Her popularity began to wane.
Yes, not just in Chrysalis, but apparently across Daconia. People felt the burden of these policies.
Even though the Chronicle mentions her goal was sound finance, restoring the treasury.
Right. Her stated aim was to get the realm's coffers back to the level they were under Gair the Thrifty, a famously frugal past king, partly to fund the armies fighting in Lior.
A necessary goal, maybe, from her perspective, raising funds for the military.
Necessary, perhaps, but the way she did it, the impact it had for many subjects, it just felt like a return to hardship, austerity imposed from above.
It's that classic tension, isn't it? The ruler's long-term strategic needs versus the immediate impact on the people's lives and wallets.
Absolutely. She had a goal, but the short-term pain eroded her support base.
So wrapping up these early years, 456 to 460, it seems like a real mixed bag.
Definitely. You see this incredibly active regent making huge efforts, rebuilding the city, creating social safety nets, trying to impose a moral order, projecting frugality.
Yeah, really significant actions, clearly driven by a strong will, but
those same actions, particularly the strict regulations and the heavy taxes, caused real problems. They bred resentment, fueled illegal activity, and made life harder for ordinary Daconians.
So the very drive to restore and reform also planted the seeds for future trouble.
It certainly looks that way. A period of major achievements, yes, but also one where discontent was clearly brewing just beneath the surface. That balancing act between the realm's needs and the people's well-being. It seems she might have leaned too hard one way, at least in the eyes of many of her subjects.
Right. It makes you think, looking back at everything she tried to do in those first few years, all the rebuilding, the social engineering, the moral campaigns, how much can any leader really push for that kind of top-down change, especially moral change, without, pushing a big chunk of the population away?
That's the core question, isn't it?
And maybe in her specific situation, coming out of the Taufan uprising, needing money, needing order, was that tension between restoring the state and the economic hit on citizens just inevitable? Something to chew on, definitely. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really getting into a complex piece of history, looking at these chronicle excerpts you've brought about the war in Lior.
That's right. Lior, this land they called Shining, under Daconian rule. It's quite a story.
Shining. Sounds idyllic, but the history seems anything but.
Exactly. The sources paint this picture of Lior, east of Daconia, dominated by the Yuliak River and all its tributaries. Very fertile, hence the name.
But politically,
Historically, just a patchwork. Warring principalities, city republics, especially after the old Elias Empire fell apart.
though there was that brief period of unity, the first Western Arcanate.
Yeah, way back. High King Gair IV, Archon Pace fell. It actually included Daconia for a bit. But that didn't last. It collapsed, and Lior went back to its fragmented state.
Okay, so a long history of division, even before Daconia shows up in the, 5th century HKC?
Precisely. And that's the backdrop for our deep dive today. We want to unpack this conflict, where it came from, who all the players were, because it gets complicated, and why it became such a persistent, difficult problem for Daconia.
Right. Let's really set that scene then. Lior, east of Daconia, rivers everywhere.
Dominated by the Yuliak system, yeah.
And shining, you said, because it's so fertile, flat land, gleaming fields, cities like jewels along the rivers.
That's the image. Clearly a place of wealth, which of course makes it a prize. And historically a source of conflict even among the Liori states themselves.
Always fighting each other after the Elias Empire fell.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
That first Arcanate you mentioned, that was really the exception, not the rule. A temporary blip of unity. Once it fell apart, Lior just reverted to type. Lots of internal fighting.
Okay. And this is the situation Daconia steps into. Gair IV, the Eagle, early 5th century.
Yes. The Chronicle says he intervened ostensibly to stop these Atheranti lords from the east taking over. Claimed he wanted to end the constant wars and suffering in Lior.
And he conquered the heartland. The richest bits.
The wealthiest, most populated central parts, yes. But what's really striking is how he financed it.
Ah, right. You mentioned this. He didn't just plunder.
No, he refused to live off the land. The sources are clear he bought provisions from merchants, which sounds maybe, less harsh. But it put Daconia massively in debt from the get-go.
That's fascinating. A decision made then has huge ripples later, so massive debt incurred. And he also refounded the Western Arcanate.
He did, claimed it never really ended, just went dormant. And under this revived Arcanate, he grouped the conquered cities and principalities into 6 confederations, the 6 leagues.
With defense pacts tied to Daconia.
Mutual defense, yes, between themselves and with Daconia. So a new structure tied directly to Daconian power and Daconian finances, which were already strained.
And the Chronicle points out that his successor, Gair III, saw the problem pretty quickly. He ruled from 423 to 455 HKC.
He did. Gair IV's grandnephew, actually, and older. He realized that maintaining this river empire, well, it was going to bankrupt Daconia if things didn't change.
So he needed solutions. Fast.
And his solutions were quite specific and,
Yeah.
well, they caused their own set of problems down the line.
What did he do?
Okay, first, he made the leagues keep their common defense funds on Silas Island, watched over by a Daconian castle, naturally.
Right. Keep the money close.
And second, he compelled the leagues to pay a big chunk of the cost for the Daconian garrisons and castles stationed in Lior.
Shifting the burden.
Exactly. And third, heavy tolls on river transport for anyone not in the leagues, hitting trade.
Did it work? Financially?
It seems it did restore Daconia's solvency, yeah, for a while at least. And there was peace initially under this new system.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Chronicle emphasizes that a new generation grew up. They didn't remember the chaos before Daconia. All they saw was this foreign presence, these financial burdens,
Mm.
and resentment started to build.
Where was it strongest?
Seems to have been mainly in the poorer, larger principalities, and the cities further upstream on the tributaries. Maybe the ones feeling the pinch from Gair's reforms the most, or seeing less benefit from the Daconian order.
And this resentment, it finds an outlet.
It does. The Black Knights reappear. The Chronicle calls them an eternal scourge. But now they have a new angle. They style themselves as Liori patriots.
Patriots fighting Daconia.
Well, yes, but it's more complicated. Their rhetoric labels Daconians pagan barbarians. But who do they actually attack? Often it's Liori Liniori communities, the farmers in the borderlands.
Why attack their own people?
The pretext was collaboration, paying taxes to Daconia, supplying grain, basically punishing them for participating in the system.
So Liori attacking Liori under the banner of patriotism. That's dark.
Very. And the source contrasts this with the earlier Black Knights, who were more like, nobles playing highwaymen, robbing merchants before Valkyr arrived. This felt different. The leagues and Daconians saw it as influence from those poorer southern principalities.
And things escalated.
Massively. Crown Prince Ionin was sent to Curiat's League, one of the worst-hit eastern areas in 440 HKC. He died the next year.
Ionin's death, that must have been a shock.
Huge turning point. After that, the Chronicle says the whole border region just erupted. Thousands of small raids every year. And sedition starting to bubble up inside the Arcanate cities, too.
Which brings us to the Liori elites. The Kilniari nobility, the Amatiniari merchants. Where did they stand?
Mixed bag, according to the source. Many genuinely hated Daconian rule. Others, well, maybe they saw a chance to gain power by undermining the Daconians.
So they helped the rebels.
Some did. Crucially, by providing intelligence, info on League army movements, Daconia patrol.
Letting the rebels stay one step ahead.
Exactly. So the Daconians would go charging off after reports, only to find empty camps, burned villages, and dead Liniari. It was chasing shadows.
And the Liniari, the farmers, caught in the middle.
Horrifically so. As the raids got worse through the 440s, they abandoned their fields. Where do you go? The cities.
Fleeing for safety.
But the cities couldn't cope. Swelling populations, bread prices skyrocketing, riots breaking out. Eventually, cities just started shutting their gates. No more refugees.
Leaving the Liniari stranded outside.
And here's the really grim twist. The leagues couldn't protect them. So these desperate farmers, who knew how to survive off the land, many ended up joining the very brigands who were causing the chaos.
Joining the rebels. Why?
Because the rebels, outside the walls, knew how to find food, how to live rough. It was survival.
Wow. So the rebel numbers grew not just from ideology, but desperation.
Definitely swelled the ranks. From dozens to hundreds, then thousands. And their tactics were maddening for the Daconians.
Oh, that's so.
They could take over a district, maybe? But the moment Daconian troops showed up in force, poof, they'd just scatter. Like a school of small fish, the Chronicle says, melt away, leaving the Daconians in charge of burned, empty land.
A guerrilla war, essentially. Elusive, frustrating.
And this constant grinding conflict became Gair III's big problem. By the time his successor, Gair IV, came along, these attacks were everywhere south of the Uliok. Especially bad in the east. At Curiat, Ligier.
Did Gair III ever consider just leaving? Cutting his losses?
He did. The source mentions debates.
Yeah.
With his council, the dukes, even Queen Dianes. He talked about pulling out of eastern Lior.
But the council advised against it.
Strongly. They warned it would just encourage rebellion elsewhere.
Yeah.
Show weakness.
And Gair himself, he seemed conflicted.
Deeply. He lamented that Daconia and Lior were just too different. Referenced some figure, Caranus, from the first Arcanid, who apparently argued for division back then. Gair said he didn't want to rule people who hated him so much.
That's quite a statement from a king.
It is. And you get that little glimpse of court life, too. Queen Dianes apparently quipped, "Who is this Caranus? Why hasn't my husband introduced me to her?"
Huh. A bit of dry wit in a grim situation.
Right. But despite his doubts, Gair III didn't withdraw. He kept sending more troops, more militiamen, right up until he died in 455 HKC.
Which probably just made things worse.
The source says it bred more resentment, yeah. Especially since the leagues had to pay for these extra troops. So the cycle continued. This dark shadow, as the Chronicle calls it.
So, okay, the Daconians are stuck in this endless conflict. Did they even understand who they were fighting, what the rebels wanted?
That was a huge part of the problem. They'd capture rebels, interrogate them, get information. But they couldn't get a clear picture of the motivations. Because there wasn't one clear picture. It was incredibly fragmented.
Fragmented. But they all wanted the Daconians out, right?
That was the only thing they agreed on. Daconian troops leave Lior. Beyond that, a complete mess.
Like what? What kind of demands?
Oh, all sorts. You had factions wanting their specific city to be independent again and often fighting each other over it. Some wanted the leagues to be independent, maybe form their own confederation without Daconia.
Okay, local independence versus regional independence.
Then others dreamed of a united Lior, a single kingdom. But even that was complicated. West, Central, East Lior all had different ideas. Some Amitenari just wanted Daconians out of the river trade, give them back control of the tributaries.
Economic motives.
Definitely. Then there was the religious angle, Daconians as pagan barbarians. Some Liori felt they should rule Daconia, convert them, drive them out.
Wow. And it gets even stranger, doesn't it?
It really does. You had these radical groups, millenarian beliefs, especially among the lower Ventinari, the urban poor. They saw the war as the end times. Gair, or his Airtorian, was the destroyer. Some Vical, king of Lior, was the child of light. They did reckless things trying to provoke the Daconians, like they were hastening prophecy.
End times cults mixed in with everything else.
And at the other extreme, some wanted to bring back ancient Elias paganism. Old gods, forbidden magic, alchemy, necromancy, witchcraft, even restoring pagan emperors. That appealed to some Ventinari and Emitinari too.
So religious fervor pulling in multiple directions.
And then add a social justice element. Some rebels weren't just anti-Daconian, they were anti-elite, targeting Daconians because they protected the Liori Kilniari, Amatiniari, Ventinari, the nobles, merchants, city folk who they felt oppressed the Lineari farmers.
The farmers again.
Their idea was put the common farmers in charge and war and hunger would end, a kind of peasant revolt ideology mixed in.
This is dizzying. So many different groups, aims, ideologies, all lumped together as rebels.
Exactly, and sometimes led by brutal figures, like the leader who took Darius in the late 440s. His rule reportedly caused 100,000 deaths, forced twice that many to flee north. Utter chaos.
No wonder the Daconians were confused.
Right. Their own experience of revolt was usually over, specific things. Unfair tax is a bad overseer. But here, the Lior seem to be revolting against the idea of Daconia rule, even without obvious direct oppression sometimes, chasing these untested social theories or lost histories or totally unattainable visions.
The Chronicle names some groups: Arcanist, Eliasist, Collectivist.
Yeah, labels for these different streams of thought. Ideas that Daconians just saw as chaotic, unworkable. Plus, you always had plain opportunists just taking advantage of the mess.
Okay, so chaos, confusion, multiple factions, and then there's the Prince of Lior.
Ah, yes. The final layer of mystery. Around 442 HKC, this idea starts popping up among different rebel groups. Talk of a single, hidden leader orchestrating everything, this Prince of Lior.
But the Daconians didn't see any evidence of coordination.
None at all. On the ground, they just saw chaos. Liori fighting Liori, Daconians trying to stop the violence and getting called barbarians for their trouble. No grand strategy visible.
Yet the stories about this prince, they were pretty wild.
Absolutely extraordinary. Supernatural stuff. He could travel impossibly fast, use magic elven stones to appear anywhere, torture prisoners remotely, heal them, issue orders through these stones.
Sounds like pure myth, folklore.
That's how the Daconians and their Liori allies saw it. Superstition, legends born out of desperation, makes sense.
There was that one thing Ionin noticed before he died.
Exactly, that nagging question. If the trouble started down south, why did Ionin find men from west and central Lior fighting way over in the east? It suggested some kind of coordination, some movement of people that didn't easily fit the picture of purely local uprisings.
Which doesn't prove the prince existed, but it adds to the confusion.
It absolutely does. This mix of brutal, chaotic reality, the incredibly diverse rebel motivations, and these fantastical stories about a hidden leader, it all just deepened the Daconian sense that they were stuck in a conflict they simply didn't understand.
So we've traced quite a path through this chronicle. From Daconia stepping in, Valkair's well-intentioned but costly financial decisions, Gair III trying to fix it but breeding resentment.
Leading to the reappearance of the Black Knights, the targeting of the Uliniari, the escalating violence, the complex role of the elites, the swelling of rebel ranks through desperation.
And finally, the sheer bewildering variety of rebel aims, from independence to social revolution to ancient paganism, all swirling around this mystery of the Prince of Lior.
It really drives home that history, especially conflict, is rarely simple, isn't it? It's messy. Motivations clash, things take unexpected turns. It wasn't one unified resistance, it was this fractured, chaotic eruption.
And hopefully, by digging into those specifics, Valkair's debt, Gair's tolls, the fate of the Uliniari farmers, the different rebel types like collectivists or Eliasists, the Prince Mr. You, listening, get a feel for why this was such a tangled, intractable war for Daconia. It wasn't just about military force.
Exactly. Understanding the layers is key.
Which leaves us with a question to mull over. What do you make of this Prince of Lior? The stories, the powers, the hints of coordination. Was he real? A symbol? Just a product of the chaos?
The Chronicle, at least this part of it, doesn't give us the answer. It leaves us in the same confusion the Daconians felt.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Oh, the sun sets low o'er the fields of gold, in a land where the rivers weave tales untold. I march through the autumn and the winter's cold. In Lior's dark embrace my heart grows old. Oh, I long for Daconia's fields so green, where laughter and beer and peace once were seen. Here in the east, in the land unseen, we fight for a dream that will never gleam. The rebels come as shadows in the night, with whispers of a prince whose pure delight. A phantom in the mist, a specter of fright, claiming power in the dark, a false night. Oh, I long for Daconia's fields so green, where laughter and beer and peace once were seen. Here in the east, in the land unseen, we fight for a dream that will never gleam. Oh, 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 oh. We chase them through the valleys, through the storm, yet the land grows weary and our hearts are warm. For every dawn brings only a new scorn, while my home is lost and my soul forlorn. Oh, I long for Daconia's fields so green, where laughter and beer and peace once were seen. Here in the east, in the land unseen, we fight for a dream that will never gleam. And the songs of my comrades, now distant and faint, replaced by the cries of rebels so taint. Their prince, they say, holds magic and saint, but all I see is blood and a world so faint. So I'll raise my sword and I'll make my stand, in a foreign land with a stranger's hand. But my heart's with my kin in my Daconian land, where the beer flows free and the peace is grand. Oh, I long for Daconia's fields so green, where laughter and beer and peace once were seen. Here in the east, in the land unseen, we fight for a dream that will never gleam. When the battle ends and the day is done, I'll dream of home 'neath the setting sun. For the peace I crave and the laughter won, in Daconia's embrace I'll find my one. When the battle ends and the day is done, I'll dream of home 'neath the setting sun. For the peace I crave and the laughter won, in Daconia's embrace I'll find my one.
Wait, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive into some source material describing a really tumultuous period in the history of Daconia and the Wheelock River Valley. Specifically, we're focusing on the conflict unfolding in Lior during the early reign of King Gair IV.
The chronicle takes us right back to the years immediately following the death of Gair III in 455 HKC. It was a time marked by, well, a succession crisis.
Right.
This all kind of culminates when Gair IV, who was still pretty young at the time, ascends the throne in early 456 HKC.
And this is where the action really starts in our source, isn't it? The young king's regent, his mother, Queen Mother, Bethrice Doricina, she makes this critical strategic move.
She does. She dispatches her own father, Duke Gair Doricina, into Lior.
And his mission is pretty clear-cut, right? Stabilize the region's complex political structure, the 6 vassal leagues, and take command of the Daconian forces already there.
You'd absolutely expect things to settle down with a figure like Gair arriving, a seasoned hand. But as our source vividly lays out, the opposite happened. Yeah. Instead of stabilizing, the situation began to rapidly, unravel. This period marks the critical beginning of the Daconian River Empire losing its grip, starting to crumble in this absolutely vital region.
So why dive into this specific moment then? Our mission really is to extract the crucial insights from this chronicle. We want to understand the sequence of events like the dominoes that fell, identify the key players and factions involved, and really pinpoint the factors that drove this significant decline. All of this happens, remember, right as a new young king was just trying to find his footing.
Exactly. We'll follow Gair's efforts and see how, despite some, initial successes, the situation escalated dramatically, particularly through the year 457 HKC.
Okay, so 457 HKC, the chronicle places Gair Doricina arriving in the eastern lands of what's called the Arconate.
That's right. The Arconate was essentially the Daconian administrative region covering Lior. His primary task upon arrival is to quell a growing insurrection already stirring in the east.
And he wastes no time setting up shop, so to speak.
Not at all. He establishes his main base of operations, his stronghold, in the city of Uriash. In fact, he designates Uriash itself as the capital of a newly formed political entity, the League of Uriash, really consolidating power around his command center.
Okay. And he comes with backup.
Oh, yes, considerable resources. The source gives us quite a specific inventory of the naval power supporting him on the Wheelock River. A fleet of 50 great barges.
50. Wow.
220 galleys, and 90 other various vessels. And it's a notable detail from the source that many of these ships weren't strictly Daconian. They were hired from the Amitaniari, who were, skilled maritime people in the region.
That's a significant force. But his very first major strategic move, as described, it's interesting because it's not an advance.
No, it's a withdrawal.
Oh.
He pulls forces back from a number of isolated fortresses dotted along the Wheelock River.
Huh. So he's giving up ground.
Deliberately, yes. The goal seems to be consolidation, concentrating his strength into more defensible positions rather than leaving garrisons exposed.
Makes sense.
What the Chronicle then makes clear is just how quickly the Eastern Rebellion consolidates itself. Cities like Beaufort and Thinias, which had previously been part of the Daconian-aligned League of Icariati, but got absorbed under Gair's new League of Uriash structure. Well, they very rapidly form a powerful alliance.
And just declare war.
Pretty much. They openly declare hostilities against the Western Arconate.
And their demands, the source mentions them. What were they after?
Yeah, the source tells us a lot about their grievances. They're not vague. They explicitly demand territorial concessions and, crucially, an end to the tolls Daconian authorities were imposing on their river trade.
The money.
Exactly. They're seeking greater autonomy and, well, a better economic position for themselves.
Okay, so Beaufort and Thinias are in. Who else?
Adding significant weight to this eastern coalition, further east, is the city of Dialek. The source describes it as the mightiest of the Liori cities.
The mightiest, so their joining is a major development.
Absolutely. And Dialek brings its own very specific ambition to the table. Their stated goal is the annexation of the League city of Tolukure and extending their territory all the way to the Galassi River. They're definitely looking to expand their own control and influence.
And they've got the muscle to back it up.
They certainly do. They enlist 3,000 Ildvaldi mercenaries.
3,000. Wow.
And the source is quite detailed here, describing them as clad in chainmail, armed with heavy battle axes, and carrying stout shields. You get the sense they were a formidable professional fighting force. heavy hitters.
Okay, so the rebel coalition is formed, armed, and has clear goals. What's their first move?
The source describes their strategy to draw Courtier out. They lay siege to the city of Murakali, likely hoping to force a quick, decisive battle before Courtier could fully organize his new command structure.
Right, hit him before he's ready. Does he bite?
No, Courtier is explicitly described in the Chronicle as shrewd.
Shrewd. Nah.
He doesn't fall for the trap. He does take action to support Murakali, make sure it's supplied, but instead of marching directly to its relief, he takes a different path.
Oh.
He moves his army southward from Urish, deliberately preparing his forces for the inevitable confrontation, but on his own terms.
Smart. Playing the long game.
Seems like it. And as he moves south, he reclaims the fortress of Albrior. A detail the source notes was specifically named in honor of his old comrade, Albrior Vidrain.
Adds a bit of personal touch there.
It does, before he continues his advance towards Thinius.
Okay, so he's heading for one of the main rebel cities now.
Exactly. As Courtier's cavalry approaches Thinius, the source mentions the city only just manages to secure its gates against him. He sets up a strong camp outside the city, even builds a harbor to ensure his army is well supplied.
Putting them under siege himself, basically.
Effectively, yes. Poised for that showdown.
But then there's a twist.
A big one. The situation shifts. The Liori forces, having seemingly given up on this siege of Murakali, make an unexpected move.
What do?
Instead of engaging Courtier near Thinius, they redirect their main advance, not towards Courtier's army, but westward. They're threatening Urish itself, his capital.
Whoa, okay. Bold move. So Courtier has to react.
Absolutely forces his hand. He has to abandon his immediate pressure on Thinius and turn his army back westward to intercept the rebel force before they can strike at his new capital.
And this leads to the big fight.
This leads to the major engagement described as the Battle of Kalamiasaci. And the source gives us the numbers.
Yeah. What are we looking at?
The Allied rebels field 10,250 troops. Courtier has 8,200.
So he's outnumbered significantly.
Clearly outnumbered on paper, yes. However, the source highlights a key advantage for Courtier's forces, a significant contingent of Tarlani bowmen and, crucially, mounted cavalry.
Ah, mobility and ranged power. Did it make the difference?
It seems so. Despite facing superior numbers, the Chronicle states that through skillful maneuvering and fierce combat, the Daconian host achieves a significant victory.
Nice. So they drove him back.
Drove the enemy forces into retreat. This was a crucial win for Courtier in the east. It really seems like he's in a strong position to fulfill his mission at this point.
Okay. Victory at Kalamiasaci. What does Courtier do next? Press his advantage.
Exactly. Following this victory, he presses his advantage in these eastern regions.
Back to Thinius.
Right back to Thinius. Lays siege to it, captures it. And significantly, the source points out he doesn't just conquer it. He restores its political structure from a republic back to a duchy.
Oh, interesting. So putting the old guard back in power.
Precisely. Reinstating the scion of his former ducal family. This shows his aim wasn't just military control, but a deliberate effort to reimpose a specific type of Daconian-aligned political order.
Got it. So Thinius dealt with. What about the other big player, Dilek?
His attention then turns to Dialek. The source emphasizes this city is vital because it's a major hub for trade in lucrative wares coming from the 100 Islands.
Right. Trade routes. Always important.
Controlling or influencing Dialek is economically essential.
So does he try to take it?
And this is where the political landscape becomes even more complex, as described in the source. Courtier doesn't attempt to annex Dialek outright.
Why not?
The Chronicle explicitly states that doing so would provoke the ire of two powerful entities in the broader region, Kaisdale and House Rijmi.
Ah, so bigger players are watching. He has to tread carefully.
Exactly. It tells us Courtier is operating within a delicate balance of power, not just dealing with the local rebels. So instead of annexation, his aim is to compel Dialek to pay tribute to Daconia.
A less provocative form of control. Makes sense.
And he secures additional reinforcements from Fusilesi to support this ongoing campaign in the east.
Okay. And the other rebel cities. Both are cute.
His subsequent actions continue to consolidate his position there. He reclaims Monacy and compels Beaufortune to capitulate. It seems, for a moment, that Courtier is successfully tying off the loose ends.
Stabilizing the East, just like he was sent to do.
Exactly. Just as his mission intended.
But I sense a but coming.
A big one. Yet the Chronicle delivers a sharp turn. As the spring of 457 HKC continues, despite Courtier's success in the east, A grave turn of events unfolds dramatically in the West.
Oh, no.
This is the moment the source identifies as the true beginning of the Arconate's rapid decline.
And the timing, didn't you say?
The dramatic irony here, highlighted by the source, is chilling. These dire tidings of disaster in the West arrive on the very day that Courtier celebrated his victory over the Ildvaldi at Kelmé-Assisi.
Wow. Success in one place, total disaster in another simultaneously.
Exactly. Success and catastrophic failure happening at the same time, but far apart.
So what happened in the West? Which city?
The city struck is Rariquetet, described as a stalwart bastion that had been under Daconian protection for over a century. Its fall was not anticipated.
A century. Okay, so a solid Daconian foothold. Who attacked?
And the source gives us a striking description of the attackers. They are identified as people of millenarian beliefs, those who foresaw the world's end.
Millenarian, that's
Yeah.
different. So religiously motivated, maybe? Not just political?
It suggests a movement driven by religious or eschatological fervor, yeah. Adding a layer beyond simple political grievance, though the source doesn't go deep into their specific beliefs.
How did they take a stalwart bastion so quickly?
The method of attack is particularly devastating treachery from within.
Again, like with some of the defections later.
Well, this was the first major instance described. The source states that traitors among the city's own guardians opened the gates.
Unbelievable. So they just let them in.
They let in a great throng who appeared outwardly as desperate refugees seeking safety. But hidden beneath their robes, they secretly bore weapons and, well, a deadly purpose.
A Trojan horse situation, basically.
Something like that. This horde floods into Rariquetet. And why is Rariquetet so crucial? The source makes it clear. It was a vital supply base for the Daconian fleet operating on the river.
Oh, man. The fleet.
The immediate impact is catastrophic. Before the Daconian ships can react or escape the harbor, 30 of them are burned.
30 ships. Just like that. Ouch. That's a crippling blow.
It isn't just a loss of a city. It's a huge hit to Daconia's logistical and naval capacity in the region.
What about the people? The loyal citizens, the remaining garrison?
Those who aren't immediately overwhelmed seek refuge in the city's formidable sandstone citadel. The source mentions it's built of Voltaian stone, suggesting it's a tough, ancient structure. They barricade themselves inside as the city around them descends into utter chaos and violence.
A siege within a fallen city. Grim. Did the chaos spread?
It didn't stay contained in Rariquetet for long. The source shows a rapid domino effect across the western Arconate.
How so?
Garrisons stationed in nearby Lysil and Timocopsy attempt to march to the aid of besieged Rariquetet.
Trying to relieve the citadel.
Presumably, yes, but they're intercepted before they can even reach the city.
Intercepted. By who?
They're attacked by forces from Lamenta to the southwest and Grulets from the southeastern highlands. This shows it wasn't just Rariquetet. Coordinated resistance was popping up elsewhere.
So the relief columns failed.
They were forced to retreat after fierce skirmishes.
And Lysil itself.
Lysil soon falls to the rebels' onslaught. The momentum is clearly with the rebellion now.
What about other major strongholds?
Even in Palua, described as being in the heart of Lyor, a significant Daconian stronghold, the city comes under attack.
Do they hold?
They manage to repel the assault and hold their ground, but the source says it's at a steep cost in lives. Many Paluan troops slain. Their defense is successful, but it leaves them weakened.
And the rebels, are they just mobs or getting organized?
The source notes they're quickly becoming more sophisticated. They're organizing into formidable columns using 12-foot-long lances.
Wad pikes?
Yeah, acting as a defensive screen, shielding their heavily armored archers and crossbowmen behind them. This indicates evolving tactics and organization beyond just, simple insurgency.
This sounds like it's escalating incredibly fast.
Frighteningly fast for the Daconians. The scale solidifies. 50 cities in the southern highlands openly align themselves with the rebels.
50 just joined the rebellion.
50, yes. And internal weaknesses continue to facilitate the collapse, mirroring the treachery in Rariquetet. The city of Sibri is taken through similar betrayal.
Another inside job.
Seems like it. Another instance of inside forces turning against Daconia.
This is becoming a pattern.
And then, Ansitui, a strategically vital city controlling key river and road crossings, essentially a choke point.
Crucial for logistics.
Absolutely. It pledges allegiance to the rebels. This gives them control over essential supply and communication routes, really crippling Daconian movements in the west.
So the rebels have momentum, numbers, strategic locations.
And they use it. With these strongholds taken, the insurgents pour northward, joining forces with those who had attacked Palua earlier and retreated.
Consolidating their forces.
Yeah, just 3 weeks later, Robavi's also lost to the rebellion's advance.
Another city gone. Is this just in the south and west?
No, the source paints a grim, broad picture. It describes a wider insurrection erupting among the Uliniari people of central Lior. 50 other cities across this central region are assailed during this period of rapid collapse.
50 more, so potentially 100 cities in revolt.
It certainly sounds like he was reaching that kind of scale. And the source adds that many castles and shrines, not just military targets, but cultural and potentially religious sites, are burned. Widespread destruction.
Is anywhere holding out?
Amidst this overwhelming tide, the source notes only 3 cities managed to hold firm against the onslaught. Palua, weakened, but still standing,
Okay.
along with Iroquois and Uraval. But they seem like islands in a sea of rebellion.
And Courtier, he's still way over in the east.
That's the striking contrast the source keeps drawing. He's still in Uriash, far across the Arcanate, receiving these increasingly grim news reports as the region he was sent to stabilize fractures at its core in the west.
What can he even do from that far away?
His response is necessarily limited, but the chronicle details what he could do. He orders Daconian forces stationed north of the Uliak River to move south and west.
Stripping garrisons in the north? That sounds risky too.
It probably was, leaving those areas potentially vulnerable. But he needed troops desperately in the west.
Did it help?
Well, the source notes a frustrating difficulty. When these reinforcing forces arrive in the western zones, the enemy is elusive, described as appearing as if from shadows.
Guerrilla tactics. Or just avoiding direct confrontation.
It sounds like they weren't presenting a clear, organized force for the Daconian relief troops to easily engage. Made it hard to stem the tide effectively.
Did he send any of his own troops from the east?
He did manage to dispatch an additional 3,600 troops directly from his own forces in the east to head west.
3,600. It's something, but against maybe 100 rebellious cities.
Might feel like sending a bucket of water to put out a forest fire, yeah.
Any successes at all for the Daconians in the west during this time?
There is one minor success noted in the source. A Daconian commander, Orgolian Vitalfin, manages to reclaim the city of Robavi in the 9th month of 457 HKC.
Reclaimed Robavi. Okay, finally some good news.
Well, the chronicle adds a very telling detail. It was achieved, albeit without resistance.
Ah, so the rebels had just left.
Exactly. It implies they weren't defeated there, they had already moved on, leaving behind what was for Daconia kind of an empty victory in a city that had already been lost and likely looted or damaged.
Not exactly turning the tide then. Does the rebellion slow down?
No sign of it. The source describes yet another wave of coordinated attacks sweeping across the Arcanate.
Another wave, right now.
3 Liori armies emerge, capturing Kellerixi, Thriera, Barakir, and Jeshur. And critically, the source states that these cities didn't just fall.
What?
They welcomed them as liberators.
Liberators. Wow, okay, that's huge. This isn't just a military campaign against Daconia, it was popular support.
That's a crucial insight, yes. It tells us this isn't purely driven by ambitious leaders. There's a sense of genuine liberation from Daconian rule in many places. The ground was fertile for this.
So where are these liberating armies heading?
These advancing rebel forces then close in on Theresio.
Theresio. The source mentions that one specifically.
Yes, describes it as the grandest city of central Lior. Taking Theresio would be a massive, symbolic and strategic blow to Daconia.
The grandest city. Does it fall?
It does. And the fall of Theresio, as described, really exemplifies the internal rot that plagued the Daconian Arcanate.
Oh, so more treachery.
Exactly. The chronicle notes that within the city itself, rebel sympathizers among the local nobility and even the garrison rise up.
Inside the city, while it's being attacked.
Yes, turning against their political rivals and undermining the defense from the inside as the external rebel armies attack. A coordinated internal and external assault.
So the Daconian defenders are caught in the middle.
Completely overwhelmed and slaughtered. The source doesn't flinch from the brutality, including a gruesome, visceral detail.
What is it?
Their corpses are left hanging from the white city walls, described as a feast for the ravens.
Oh, God. That's graphic, a deliberate message.
Absolutely. It underscores the ruthlessness of the conflict and the grim fate of those loyal to Daconia.
And strategically, what does losing Theresio mean?
It's devastating. As the principal harbor and trade hub of central Lior, its loss cripples Daconian logistics and economic control in that whole central region.
And the fleet, any ships there?
Adding insult to injury, 40 Daconian galleys are captured in its harbor.
40 more galleys lost. This is just unraveling completely.
The wave of rebellion continues to spread and consolidate control, specifically weakening the Daconian leagues of Ligier and Imadi as more cities across those territories fall to the insurgents.
And the defections continue.
The source highlights another pattern contributing to the collapse. In true Liori fashion, it says.
True Liori fashion, what does that mean?
It implies a reputation, perhaps, for political opportunism. Many within the Daconian line structures defected without warning, having waited for the opportune moment the rebels' clear ascendance to switch allegiances.
So loyalty was pretty thin on the ground.
It underscores the deep-seated discontent and the fragile nature of Daconian loyalty in the region, yeah.
How does the Chronicle end this period? We're getting towards the end of 457 HKC now?
It brings us to its conclusion in the 12th month of 457 HKC, as winter arrives and the Cientos festivities, presumably a significant cultural event, are underway.
Festivities,
Yeah.
amidst all this chaos.
Well, the source sets a scene in the city of Faricio, which seems to be under rebel control. People are described celebrating in white and blue garments, openly using spoils they've taken from their former rulers, clearly referring to the deposed Daconians. There's a palpable sense of triumph and defiance in the air.
Celebrating their victory.
Seems like it. And the final scene leaves us in Thuaricio, the newly conquered grand city, in its hall of magistrates, which the source calls the Gilded Palace.
Okay, what's happening there?
Rebel leaders, generals, their entourages, they're all gathered, awaiting a crucial announcement.
An announcement? What's it going to be?
The chronicle ends right there, building anticipation for what this formal announcement will signal. Likely the birth of the Kingdom of Lior, rising from the ashes of the Daconian collapse in the region.
Wow, what a cliffhanger. So, bringing this back to you listening, why does diving into this specific, seemingly distant historical account matter? Why should you care about Daconia and Lior in 457 HKC?
Well, this isn't just some dry account of a faraway war, is it? It's a powerful case study in how incredibly quickly a seemingly stable power structure, one that had stood for a century in Rerikwiteksk, could just crumble.
Yeah, crumble and faced with widespread internal dissent and coordinated rebellion, especially as we saw here, when the response is fragmented or, delayed because the commander's on the wrong side of the map.
Exactly. It vividly demonstrates how focusing your strategic efforts intensely in one area, like Courtier's successful campaign in the East, can be completely negated or undermined by a catastrophic, rapid collapse happening simultaneously elsewhere. The West, in this case.
And it really highlights the devastating impact of internal treachery and betrayal, which we saw repeatedly, right? Opening gates, flipping allegiances at the crucial moment.
And it underscores the crucial role that popular sentiment plays. Those cities welcoming liberators. That tells you the ground was fertile for rebellion long before the armies even marched. It wasn't just imposed from the top down.
Absolutely. And the Chronicle, well, it doesn't shy away from the brutal realities and the human cost of such conflicts. It captures it in those stark, memorable details, like the ships burning in the harbor or the bodies left on the walls as a warning.
It's pretty visceral. So we've taken this deep dive into the Chronicle, following Courtier's initial hard-won successes over in the East.
Only to witness the incredibly rapid and devastating unraveling of Daconian control across the vast western and central regions of Lior. It just fell apart.
It's a powerful historical reminder, really, that power structures, even long-standing ones, can fracture with astonishing speed when multiple pressures, military defeat, political instability, internal betrayal, and widespread social or economic grievances all align against them.
And Courtier. He was sent to stabilize, but ultimately found himself just trying to halt this tidal wave with, frankly, limited means, getting grim news from a distance as the core of the Arcanet just collapsed under him.
Yeah, an impossible situation by the end.
So this chronicle leaves us right at the moment of this new Liori entity being born, and it raises a fascinating kind of central question for you to consider. Given the sheer speed and depth of this Daconian collapse, the widespread defections, those cities welcoming rebels as liberators, what were the true underlying grievances, the things that had been simmering beneath the surface for maybe that whole century?
Was it just about tolls and territory, like the initial demands suggested? Or was there something much deeper about the nature of Daconian rule in Lior itself that had sown the seeds for this massive, near-total insurrection.
And now, with this new kingdom seemingly poised to emerge from the fighting, what shape will it take? What will this kingdom of Lior actually look like?
Yeah, definitely something to mull over.
Welcome to a deep dive into some absolutely fascinating source material you've shared with us.
Really great stuff today.
Yeah, today we're plunging into a really pivotal moment in Lior's history. We're exploring how the Daconian River Empire's grip just sort of crumbled.
And how this single figure emerged to unify, well, a pretty fractured land.
We've got quite the collection to guide us, haven't we?
We do. Excerpts from Gair IV, Chapter 6, which kind of sets the historical scene.
Okay.
Then there's the Chronicle of the Coronation. That gives us a real front row seat to one dramatic night.
I love those kinds of sources.
And R'Chor's War, which really lays bare the long game behind it all.
Oh.
The strategy.
Right. So our mission is pretty clear. Unpack the chaos in Lior first.
Understand the background.
Then experience this, incredibly striking coronation through the eyes of the source.
Yeah.
And then pull back the curtain on the intricate, decades-long strategy that made it all happen.
All distilled from the pages right here.
Yeah, exactly. And to really get that dramatic moment, that coronation.
You need the context first.
Yeah.
You absolutely need to understand the mess Lior was in.
Okay, let's set that scene then. According to these sources, the Daconian River Empire, they'd controlled Lior, right? Part of their Western Arcanate.
That's it. But they were reeling. Big problems back home.
It started after Emperor Gair III died, around 455 HKC.
Yeah, HKC, holding kingdom calendar, just for context. That death kicked off a full-blown succession crisis.
Right, so eventually Gair IV takes the throne, 456 HKC.
But he's young, so his regent mother tries to stabilize things. She sends her own father, Ducordier Dorazin, to Lior.
His job, basically, get the 6 vassal leagues under control again. These were the main regions in Lior.
Right, kind of the administrative chunks. And, initially he wasn't completely unsuccessful.
No.
The source mentions he led a campaign out east, even managed to retake a city, Thinius, by 457 HKC.
So some effort to put the pieces back together.
They were trying.
Yeah.
But initially is the key word there.
Because 457 HKC is when everything just went sideways.
And fast. The sources paint this picture of just widespread collapse.
Hundreds of riots, rebellions.
Rebel forces started capturing Daconian cities, castles, left and right.
So it wasn't just, localized unrest.
No, it was systemic breakdown. It led to the situation where Daconian armies, maybe holding on to bits of eastern Lior, found themselves totally isolated. Cut off by these huge swaths of territory now controlled by different rebel groups.
Central authority just dissolving.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And it's right in the middle of all that fragmentation, that chaos.
That something extraordinary was planned.
Exactly. The sources tell us about this major gathering in Thuricio.
Which was described as the greatest city in central Lior.
Yeah, a big deal. And this is where the Chronicle of the Coronation really comes alive.
Takes us right there.
It focuses on one specific night. The very last day of the 12th month, 457 HKC.
Right before their New Year's festival, the Cicientos.
Perfect timing for drama.
So, picture Thuricio, a city of 80,000 people, just freed from imperial rule.
Must have been buzzing.
The source says filled with grand celebration, people in fine clothes, exuberant cheer.
Food and drink everywhere, provided by the rebels. Sounds electric.
But inside the Palace of Magistrates, different story.
In a place called the Hall of Deities, which is a great name considering.
Named for ancient rulers, yeah. Nice touch.
Inside there, the mood was, different. A mix of anticipation, maybe tension.
Who was there?
You had wealthy citizens, representatives from various rebel armies, dressed in fine black silk, the source notes.
Okay.
Different political factions, too. Confederationists, imperialists, leaders from all over. All gathered.
And they were all wondering the same thing, right?
Absolutely. The big question. Who's going to be the new king of Lior?
Any guesses mentioned?
Oh, yeah. Maybe the Prince of Dialek. Someone from Faisilico? Perhaps the Duke of Lucere?
So, lots of speculation, no clear answer.
None at all. And at the center of the hall, this throne. Really striking.
Made of what?
Crystal glass and blackwood.
Yeah.
And guarded. 6 knights with crossbows.
Crossbows, okay. Holding the crown?
Holding a silver diadem, yeah. The crown itself, sitting right there.
This is where the Chronicle really builds the scene, doesn't it? As midnight gets closer.
That hopeful buzz just shifts. Tension ramps up.
Armed soldiers take positions along the walls.
Yeah. And then servants start putting out the candles.
Plunging the hall into darkness.
A dim and foreboding darkness, the source says. The only real light left.
The throne.
An eerie blue glow coming from the crystal throne.
Wow. Talk about stage management.
Seriously. If the source is accurate, it's incredible theater. And in that precise moment,
the unexpected happens.
this silver-haired emissary steps forward. Someone nobody really knew.
How long had he been there?
Only arrived in the city 3 days prior, apparently. Total unknown.
And he just walks up to the throne.
Walks calmly, picks up the diadem.
No.
And places it on his own head.
Gets right on the throne.
Sits down, and the source describes him just surveying the whole assembly with this chilling gaze.
Ooh.
Midnight strikes. Old year ends, new one begins. And this profound silence falls over the hall.
You could hear a pin drop, I bet.
Totally. And then his guards. Now suddenly there are 30 of them. In black armor, they start chanting.
In unison, what did they say?
A very clear proclamation. Long live our august sovereign, the great prince and king of all Lior, Roichar I of the House Lucert.
Roichar I.
All bow before your new sovereign, who shall lead our people into a new golden age.
And did they? Bow.
The sources note the nobles there, the ones now under rebel sway.
That did bow.
Well, the detail that sticks with you is, as crossbows remained pointed at them.
So not entirely voluntary reverence.
This is like a mix of shock, maybe fear, and power assertion.
That is such a potent image. Power through control, intimidation.
Absolutely. And this was Roichar I, this completely unexpected self-declared coronation.
Marks the formal start of his bid to unify Lior.
Exactly. But, like you said, he seemed to appear out of nowhere.
So who was he?
Okay, this is where the Roichar's War source comes in. It tells us who he really was. Born way back, 394 HKC.
So he wasn't young at this coronation.
No, he was 64 in early 458 HKC when this happened. He'd eventually be known as Roichar the Magnificent, founder of the Kingdom of all Lior.
And the key insight here from the sources is that despite seeming like a sudden arrival,
he wasn't a new player at all, not even close.
They've been planning this
meticulously, building alliances, sketching out his grand design for almost 30 years, working in the shadows.
30 years, wow.
Yeah. In his younger days, known then as Rocher of Lucert, he actually served under a famous Daconian commander, Gair IV.
Valtaire the Eagle.
That's the one. Rocher learned the art of war directly from him. Page, ensign, commander, saw it all.
That's fascinating. Comparing their approaches must be insightful then.
Hugely. Gair IV was a brilliant tactician. He perfected methods against specific enemies' trolls, rigid Eastern armies.
What kind of method?
Mounted infantry, supply depots, fluid battles. His wars were what brought Lior under Daconian control initially.
But contained battles?
Relatively, yeah. Maybe 10 miles wide. Decided quickly, tactical victories.
Okay. And Roichar.
Roichar documented his own vision, 3 volumes, on the battle for Lior. His scope wasn't tactical, it was grand strategy. Massive.
Oh, massive.
He envisioned a theater of war not 10 miles wide, but 1,000 miles wide and 400 miles deep.
The whole country.
He was thinking about the entire map, not just winning battles, but winning the whole thing.
And for him, the biggest challenge wasn't just fighting the Daconians, was it?
No. He pinpointed the core problem as the Liori people themselves.
That sounds harsh.
His writings are quite blunt. He called them fickle, prone to factionalism, disunity, and deceit.
Ouch.
More so than any other Tyrosi nation upon Kyala's soil. Tyrosi being the broader human culture group there.
And his point was?
That this internal disunity was their fatal flaw. It's what allowed outsiders, barbarians before, now the Daconians, to conquer them in the first place.
So, the strategic insight is profound. His plan wasn't just military.
Not at all. It was about manipulating the Liori's own nature against itself, in a way.
He didn't try to force them all into one big movement.
Quite the opposite. The source says his goal wasn't one movement, but 100 different movements.
100? How does that work?
He acted as an emissary, quietly listening to grievances, cultivating all these separate groups, subtly nudging those with similar goals together, but without making them one unified force.
Why not? Wouldn't unity be stronger?
His reasoning is almost chilling. He argued, these movements need not be unified. Why? Because their mutual hatred and conflict will draw followers to swell their ranks.
Whoa.
Especially as all sides commit misdeeds against one another. He thought the internal chaos itself would feed the wider rebellion, use their disunity.
Where did he start this?
He began sowing these seeds in the wilder parts of southern Lior, near Qualis, Ermanth, lawless lands.
Who lived there?
Various tribes, halflings, but also remnants of old Liori noble houses. Exiled families who'd carved out secret little principalities.
Hidden lords.
Exactly what the source calls them. They became Reuter's first captains, leading small bands. 50 to 100 men, maybe?
Where did the money come from? That always matters.
Good question. It came from dissatisfied merchants and local princes. People frozen out of the profitable Iliac region by the Daconian Arcanate.
Why were they excluded?
Because Gair IV, the previous emperor, needed cash. He restricted who could profit there to pay off debts from Valcair the Eagle's wars.
The irony, Valcair's success created the debt that fueled the later rebellion against his empire.
Precisely. Reuter saw that existing economic grievance and just exploited it, found the crack, and wedged it open.
And there's that quote from his writings, isn't there? About problems and solutions.
Yeah, it really stands out, almost Machiavellian or just brutally pragmatic. If one needs to present the urgency of a solution, first create a problem. Or rather, illustrate why the situation that allowed the problem to arise is the true problem. Very clever framing.
He used examples, right? Liori disunity allowing barbarians in.
And the recent economic exclusion causing all that dissatisfaction in the South. He pointed to the root causes as the real issue.
But dissatisfaction alone doesn't overthrow an empire.
Exactly. It simmers, but doesn't boil over. He needed to engineer a crisis to force the issue.
Which brings us to the Uliniari raids. This is crucial.
Absolutely calculated move. He didn't initially hit Daconian forces hard. He used swift cavalry raids against the Uliniari.
In the Uliniari were?
The source says they were vital. The agricultural backbone. Farmers, basically. Essential to the food supply and wealth of the League Lords in the cities.
Okay, so targeting them. Why?
It had this brilliant dual purpose, according to the analysis here. First, drive them off their lands. What does that do?
Disrupts food production, grain prices go up.
Exactly. Instant inflation. Which puts the king of Daconia in a terrible bind.
How so?
Either he lets inflation run wild in Lior, making everyone even more unhappy with Daconian rule, or he has to import expensive grain from Daconia itself to stabilize prices, causing economic pain back home. Lose-lose for the empire.
Okay, that's purpose one. What's the second?
Social division. Driving a wedge between the rural Uliniari, who are now losing everything,
and the city dwellers, the Amatiniari.
Likely the merchants' nobles, the ones benefiting from Uliniari labor. The source calls the Amatiniari greedy, meaning they were reluctant to spend their own money raising armies to protect the countryside. They expected the Daconians to handle security.
So the Uliniaris are being attacked, ruined.
And the cities, fearing uprisings from these desperate, displaced people, actually closed their gates to them.
Leaving the Uliniari completely stranded.
With very few options. Flee, starve, abandon their lands. Or
join the only force that seemed active and maybe offered them a place.
Join Reuter's network, what he was calling the Army of All Lior. He created the refugees, then offered them the only seeming refuge.
That's ruthless, but effective.
Incredibly effective. So through these methods, cultivating discontent, exploiting divisions, engineering crises, like the raid share's disparate forces infiltrated Lior.
They grew stronger.
Yeah, and each faction was probably focused on its own little fight, its own grievances.
Often without realizing they were serving this much larger hidden plan.
Guided by Reuter, who often played the role of a seemingly neutral intermediary, just helping people connect.
Master manipulator.
Or master strategist, depending on your perspective. And he knew exactly when the real power centers, the cities, would flip.
When would that be?
He reasoned that once the war's costs just ruined trade and prosperity.
Yeah.
And it became undeniable that the Daconians were actually losing.
Then the city rulers would switch sides.
Then the Liori city rulers, who the source says lacked deep loyalty, especially to foreign Daconians, would see the writing on the wall. They'd realize peace required the Daconians leaving.
And then they'd back the rebels.
Then they'd lend their coin and their city banners to Reuter's cause, just to end the suffering and get back to business.
Which brings us back full circle to that night in Thracio, that coronation.
Yes, and the timing is everything. He chose to crown himself when the battle was only half won. The source is explicit about that.
Why do it then? Why not wait until the Daconians were totally defeated? Seems risky.
This is maybe the most crucial strategic insight. Reuter's own writings explain it.
What did he say?
He argued that if he'd waited until total victory, the rebel lords, now free of the Daconians.
They wouldn't need a single king anymore.
Exactly. They'd likely have immediately started fighting among themselves, trying to carve up Lior into smaller kingdoms. 3, 5, maybe 7 little realms. Back to this unity.
So by crowning himself mid-conflict?
He made himself essential. He presented himself as the figure needed to finish the fight.
The focal point.
The crucial focal point for reverence and enmity, as the source puts it. The ongoing struggle demanded a leader, someone to rally around, or even someone for opponents to unite against.
He inserted himself into that role right when they needed one most.
Precisely when the disparate factions facing that common enemy and desperate for direction were most susceptible to accepting a single leader, even if they didn't trust him or fully grasp his game.
That timing, that strategy, that's what allowed him to break the Daconian hold.
It was key to shattering what he called the Daconian center, breaking their coordinated control over central Lior, leaving their armies fragmented, scattered, just like the sources describe the situation after 457.
So when you pull it all together from these documents, it's not just a rebellion story.
No, it's a blueprint. A meticulously planned campaign of political, economic, social destabilization.
It all culminates in that incredibly theatrical coronation.
Staged perfectly, executed at just the right moment to consolidate authority while the war was still raging.
Reuter didn't just ride the wave of chaos.
He seems to have actively cultivated it, used the Lori's own disunity, exploited specific grievances, all to forge a unified state, even while the fight was far, far from over.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about strategy and leadership.
Definitely. Is leadership always about commanding this single, unified, loyal force?
Or can it sometimes be about subtly manipulating all these different, even conflating parts toward one hidden goal?
Yeah, and that quote from his strategy, it's unsettling.
If one needs to present the urgency of a solution, first create a problem.
What does it mean when the path to unity, the path to power, involves deliberately engineering or worsening the very problems you then promise to solve?
Gives you a lot to chew on about how power actually works based on these incredible sources you brought to light today.
Long live our August sovereign, the great prince and king of all your John I, the house of Kurt. All behold for your new sovereign who shall lead our people into a new golden age. In the shadow of the throne he rose unseen, crafting fate with silver threads, a master scheme. Deceit and guile in every whispered word. The king of all Lior, his name is Rukar heard. Heroica, heroica, heroica. From shattered lands he brings the dawn, the sovereign's might, the broken bow drawn. Heroica, heroica, heroica. With cunning hands he shapes the clay, a new age's ruler, leading the fray. In webs of lies he spun the fate of men, turning allies into foes with deceitful pen. The kingdoms fell, and through betrayal's art he carved the path, and now he plays his part. Heroica, heroica, heroica. From shattered lands he brings the dawn, the sovereign's might, the broken bow drawn. Heroica, heroica, heroica. With cunning hands he shapes the clay, a new age's ruler, leading the fray. Leading the fray. Liberty and confederation, they cry and cheer, yet whispers of an empire its shadows hear. The storming glory of Elias' ancient might, yet dreams of realms where magic reigns bright. Heroica, 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 heroica.
see faith. We the arcane's mystic wraith. Bring peace, they say, to the world's strife. Yet conquer all with the sovereign's knife. A paradox of promises in the wind's cry. The confederation's dream and empire's lie. Restoring old ways, or the magic arcane. The truth is masked in his sovereign's knife. A paradox of promises in the wind's cry. The confederation's dream and empire's lie. Restoring old ways, or the magic arcane. The truth is masked in his sovereign reign. He brings the dawn, the sovereign's might, the broken bow drawn. With cunning hands he shapes the clay, a new age is ruler, leading the fray. All liars with deceit as his throne, the banners of discord now set in stone. In the name of unity he reigns supreme, the ruler of the land caught in a dream.
Okay, let's dive into a world right on the brink. Imagine this. A kingdom, its longtime king just dead. Power suddenly falls to a young boy and his regents. And on one side, you've got this powerful neighbor, totally used to controlling the region, trying to impose order.
Right, keep the status quo.
Exactly. But instead of calm, it just ignites this massive firestorm. Widespread rebellion, just erupting.
And right from the heart of that chaos, a figure emerges, sort of from obscurity, really.
Yeah. And he's known for what? Strategic brilliance, a chilling ruthlessness, and this cunning guile that confuses everyone, friends and enemies alike.
And he's not just going to lead this rebellion. He's about to claim kingship over this fractured land and, well, completely reshape its destiny.
That's the dramatic canvas the sources for this deep dive are painting for us today, isn't it?
It really is. We're digging into chronicles, historical accounts. They detail this pivotal, pretty brutal decade in this world's history, specifically the years 455 to 465 HKC.
HKC, just think of that as their calendar marker. The focus is really that 10-year span.
Exactly. 10 years, that changed everything.
Right. So the opening scene,
Yeah.
the kingdom of Daconia, they're facing a succession crisis after King Gair III dies in 455 HKC.
And his grandson, Gair IV, he's crowned in 456, but he's just a child.
So the real power rests with his regent, Queen Mother Bethrice, and her father, Duke Cordior d'Oisem.
And Cordior, he immediately gets handed this monumental task: go stabilize the area called Lior.
Lior, traditionally these 6 vassal leagues, right? Part of an alliance with Daconia, the Western Arcanate.
That's it. Daconia basically ran a kind of river empire along the Uliak River Valley. Cordior was sent there as their supreme commander, keep things in line.
But as our forces show, instead of stabilizing, the whole Daconian setup in Lior starts this rapid, really violent collapse.
Yeah, it unravels fast.
So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack how that happened, how this one figure, Roycer I, managed to rise so effectively in all that chaos.
And how he didn't just win the war, but fundamentally, drastically transformed Lior. We're using these historical accounts as our guide.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning then. The seeds of rebellion, you could call it. Roughly 455 to 457 HKC.
Right. Gair III's death in 455 kicks off that uncertainty. Young Gair V's coronation in 456. That's when Cordior gets sent to Lior, supreme commander.
And initially, the account suggests Cordior actually has some success, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. He focuses his campaign in eastern Lior, 456, 457, and he manages to reconquer Athenius, which was a pretty significant city.
You can imagine he might have felt like, okay, I'm getting this under control.
Definitely. But here's the twist, and it's critical. While Cordior is busy in the east, the rest of Lior just erupts in 457.
Erupts is the word. The sources are really emphatic. They talk about hundreds of riots, rebellions, all happening almost at once.
Yeah, rebel forces grabbing cities, castles. The whole social order just completely breaks down everywhere, it seems, except where Cordier's army actually is.
And this creates an immediate, massive strategic problem for the Daconians.
Right. Absolutely. By late 457 HKC, Cordier's armies, the ones who had that success in the east, are now totally cut off from Daconia itself.
Vast territories between them and home are suddenly in rebel hands.
Exactly. He's got an army, sure, but they're isolated, stuck deep in what's now enemy territory.
Wow. Okay, so while Cordier's isolated out east, what are the rebels doing?
They're gathering. The commanders meet in Thurica, described as the greatest city in central Lior, right before their big New Year festival, the Cientos.
And this meeting is the turning point.
It is. They gather to choose a leader and crown him.
Enter Roichar I, crowned the first king of all Lior.
That's him. The sources identify him as a Liori nobleman. Up till then, he'd been working behind the scenes an emissary, a coordinator.
Somehow linking together what the sources call hundreds of separate rebel armies. That alone sounds like a huge job.
It really speaks to his abilities even before the crown, doesn't it? And his persona, according to these accounts, is absolutely key.
Not just a warlord.
No, more than that. A master strategist. Genius matched only by his, ruthlessness and his guile.
And what he does right after being crowned king, it's just... audacious is the word the sources use.
It really is. He doesn't stick around Thurico for celebrations or anything.
That's right.
Nope. Within 3 days, he leaves. His new forces scatter, and he himself rides hidden among his own soldiers.
Completely indistinguishable.
His location is a secret, even to his own men.
To many of them, yes. The king is crowned, and then, poof, he vanishes into his own army.
What kind of message does that send?
Well, the message goes out to all the scattered lords of Lior. A strong sovereign has emerged, but there's no court, no capital, no easy way to find him or, negotiate.
Some lords must have thought it was a bluff, right? That he didn't really command everyone.
The sources say exactly that. Whispers of a bluff. And this is fascinating. That very act, the secrecy, the calculated elusiveness, it actually boosted his standing.
How so?
Well, the Lioris culturally, they apparently really value and admire guile. They call it Guji. Guji. Okay.
Yeah. And Roichar's bold, almost deceptive move, it resonated deeply with that. Made him seem more formidable, not less, more cunning.
And his strategy on the battlefield mirrored this.
Pretty much. He mostly avoided big, open-pitched battles with the Daconians. His preference, wear them down. Attrition, capture key places.
The sources give that striking statistic, don't they? For every city the Daconians retook.
Roichar's forces captured 2. It was relentless, a grinding strategy.
And this approach, plus his mysterious movements, let him consolidate power pretty quickly.
Very quickly. He started merging those scattered rebel groups, moving captains loyal to him into key spots, weaving it all into one army of all Lior.
Okay, so he's building his army, staying hidden. What about politically? His first big statement.
His first proclamation. Aimed at the parts of Lior not yet fully under his control. It's a masterclass in political maneuvering.
What did it say?
He talks about needing to balance regional interests, what the individual leagues and lords wanted with the common need for defense. Defense against the barbarian threat.
His term for the Daconians.
His term for the Daconians. He said the absolute priority was ending the war. For good. Preventing future Daconian incursions.
And crucially, he promised something for after the war.
Exactly. He promised that once the war was won, princes, magistrates, representatives from all over Lior would gather to discuss the country's future, how it would be structured.
Which sounds potentially vague.
Brilliantly vague. That's what the sources point out. It satisfied almost everyone.
Oh.
Well, if you were wary of a permanent king, the talk of future discussions let you see his rule as just temporary for the war. If you wanted a confederation, the promise of representation kept that hope alive.
And if you just wanted to fight?
If you were a hardliner, calling the Daconians barbarians and focusing on ending the war, no compromise, that was exactly what you wanted to hear. Everyone could read their own hopes into it.
Clever. So while Reuters consolidating politically, the actual fighting ramps up. This Battle of Lior period, 458 to 461 HKC.
Ramps up dramatically. The army of all Lior isn't just unified now, it's growing fast, forming disciplined brigades.
And their way of fighting was different, wasn't it? The sources highlight that.
Very different. They relied heavily on infantry, heavily armored, using long pikes packed into dense columns.
Like a phalanx.
Sorta, yeah. Often surrounding archers with crossbowmen out front, lighter cavalry on the flanks, and a reserve of knights.
And this was tough for the Daconians,
Yeah.
who were more mobile.
Incredibly tough. Those dense armored pike blocks were just very, very hard for the Daconian cavalry or faster troops to break through in a direct fight. It really changed the tactical dynamic.
But Courtier Dorizen still stuck out east. He was still fighting back. He was a capable commander.
Oh, definitely. He still managed to win some victories, and he got a bit of help from Dailek, the kingdom next door. They were pretty nervous about Reuter's sudden rise, didn't want this powerful new kingdom on their border.
Makes sense. But overall, the Daconian position just kept getting worse.
Steadily worse. Daconia tried to reinforce Courtier, pulling troops from home, pulling them from the bits of Lior they still held, like north of the Williak River.
Which just stretched them thin elsewhere, I imagine.
Exactly. And crucially, Reuter wasn't just sticking to the river valley. His forces, even refugees loyal to him, had already crossed the big Williak River, established footholds on the northern side.
And this leads to a major Daconian loss, doesn't it, on that northern bank?
It does. A commander loyal to Reuter, Samorn Vichelzi. He leads the forces that cross the Williak. They capture Dronagir city right on the north bank.
Okay.
And from there, they quickly move inland and seize Thakheist, a really strategic city.
Why was Thakheist so important?
Because capturing it completely cut off Daconian access to the Thori River.
Which was a major supply line for them.
A vital one. So now think about it. Courtier's forces are cut off by land to the west and south, and now their river supply line from the north is gone too. The walls were closing in.
So, facing this disaster, Courtier in the east, he makes a desperate move in autumn 459 HKC.
He does. He sends urgent letters east to Daconia's allies, the kingdoms of Kaisdai and Othrante, pleading for serious military aid, crush the rebellion before it's too late.
But the cavalry doesn't arrive, does it?
Not really. Neither ally was in a great position to help. Othrante, the biggest neighbor. Total chaos. Consumed by a brutal civil war.
Ah, yes. The sources mention Duke Loirod Vicoliandre, supported by Rioni mercenaries, had usurped the throne.
Exactly. The old royal family had died out, and Loirod, backed by nearly half the dukes and these mercenaries, just seized power. So Othrante was fighting itself.
And Kaisdal, the other kingdom.
Also involved, but on the other side of Othrante's civil war, King Lanther V of Kaisdau was backing the opposition against Loirod. He was hoping to use the chaos to grab some valuable Rioni lands north of the Williak River.
So Lanther actually had reason to oppose Reuter too, right? The sources say he hated him for past betrayals.
Deep personal hatred, apparently, so he wanted the Liori rebellion crushed. But even so, he could only send a token force to help Courtier.
Why only a token force?
Because his own coasts were being hammered by Aldvaldi mercenaries. Raiders tying up his own armies.
So Courtier is really stuck. No help coming. Supply lines choked.
Completely stuck. He makes the tough call. Abandon the Eastern Front entirely. Try to regroup his remaining forces by marching west, trying to get closer to Daconia.
And then, just when things seem like they can't get worse for Daconia.
They get worse. In 460 HKC, the usurper king Loirod in Othrante makes a huge move.
What did he do?
He officially recognizes the kingdom of all Lior, and he acknowledges Reuter as the Archon of the West.
Archon of the West. What does that signify?
It's massive. Recognition from an established, albeit unstable, kingdom. It basically grants Reuter on the international stage a formal claim to all the lands Daconia used to control in the West. It legitimizes him. He's not just a rebel anymore. He's a fellow sovereign in Loirod's eyes.
Wow, and this new alliance. It came with tangible benefits for Reuter.
Oh, yes. Very tangible military benefits. In return for Reuter declaring war on Loirod's enemies, specifically Kaisdal and the region of Beth Loirod, gave Reuter half of his powerful mercenary fleet.
Half his fleet. What did Reuter do with it?
Sailed it right up the Uliak River.
So let's picture this again. The Daconians in Lior, already cut off by land west and south, their northern river supply gone. And now the main river, the Uliak itself,
is being choked by a fleet allied with Reuter. They were truly, utterly trapped.
The sources describe that retreat. Courtier trying to get his men home. It sounds horrific.
Perilous is an understatement. Trapped is the word. Courtier gathers his survivors, tries to march towards Qualis, towards Daconia, sends some by ship, but most have to march.
Through territory where the enemy was everywhere.
That's the quote from the sources. Stark. They couldn't even risk splitting up.
And the losses.
Devastating. They started with 20,000 men marching from Argosy. 6 months later, 1,800 make it back to Daconia.
1,800 out of 20,000. That's almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
Over 90% lost just on the march.
Just on the march, the chronicles detail these incredible acts of sacrifice. Guys like Orgolian and Albrier before him, small groups of spearmen holding bridges, like over the Lucchese River near Dravia.
Knowing they wouldn't survive.
Knowing they wouldn't survive, just buying time for the main army to cross before they were overrun. Orgolian's son, Drolin, apparently carried his father's banner back, scarred himself.
Courtier made it back, though. Broken, the sources say.
Broken, but also filled with resolve to eventually strike back. Meanwhile, back in Daconia, the queen regent, Bethrice, she tried diplomacy, right? Sent peace offers.
She did. On behalf of her young son, the king, hoping to negotiate some kind of end.
And the response Reuchar sent back.
Brutal. Utterly brutal. The envoys returned in coffins, skins flayed, the tortures meticulously described.
A message clearer than any words. No peace on your terms. No negotiation.
So 465 HKC, that's marked as the official end of the Second Western Arcanate. The alliance built by Gair IV, generations earlier. Gone.
Collapsed under the weight of it all. The final act described in this period, the siege of Faeselico, one of the last Daconian strongholds.
Humbled into submission.
By 15,000, all Liori soldiers and 40 trebuchets, the sources say, just battered into surrender.
Daconia suffered terribly, lost almost everything in Lior. That retreat. But the sources had something chilling, don't they, about the Liors themselves?
They do. Despite winning their freedom, the sources state the Liors would ultimately pay an even greater price for the war and the unification that came next.
Which brings us to Reuchar's reign itself.
Yeah.
And the cost of his idea of unity. His own writings are revealing.
Horrifyingly revealing. In his work on the Battle of Lior, the sources quote him saying that stability in Lior just breeds dissatisfaction, that to get real unity, half of all Liors had to perish.
Half the population. He actually wrote that.
Yeah.
Believed that was necessary.
That's what the sources claim he wrote. The foundation of his rule required mass death, in his view.
And did he achieve that goal?
He got frighteningly close, according to the accounts. Not half, but roughly a quarter of the population vanished. Consumed by the very earth they once trod, is the haunting phrase used.
So his liberation was just another kind of destruction.
A harrowing ordeal. Ravaged countryside, ruined cities, years of war followed by this brutal consolidation. And then, of course, widespread pestilence, starvation, weakened populations, disease spread like wildfire.
And economically.
Yeah.
What did he do? The sources mention commerce grinding to a halt.
Deliberately, the sources state it was calculated, stop normal trade, stop normal work.
Why?
To force the unemployed, the desperate, the starving to flock to his army banners, because the army was the only place left to get food to survive.
So he keeps these huge armies mobilized even after the main fighting stops. They're dependent on him.
Exactly. Doesn't disband them, doesn't let them find other work. They are his power base, kept hungry and reliant.
And he secured control of the Uliak River through that alliance with Loirod, the fleet.
Secured it completely. So, with Lior unified, the river controlled, and a powerful ally in Othrante, Reuchar turns his eyes east.
Towards Othrante itself, answering Lorod's call to help in the civil war.
Precisely. Heeding Lorod's summons, ready to intervene more directly.
Okay, so Reuchar gets drawn into the Othrantia civil war. Lorod, the usurper king, is facing serious opposition, led by Duke Valdane of Baith.
Right. Valdane, also king of Euronia, grandson of the famous Ormcare, he rallied the northern dukes. Determined to kick Lorod out, convene a proper assembly.
And Valdane was actually doing well against Lorod initially.
Quite well. Blocked Lorod from reaching the holy city of Ilium. He was even advancing south to meet up with King Lanthair of Casedale. The plan was to crush Lorod between them.
So Lorod is desperate. What does he offer Reuchar?
He doubles down, reappoints Reuchar as Archon of the West, reinforcing that claim, and pledges his daughter Foras in marriage. A blood alliance.
And Reuchar sees his chance.
Seizes the moment. Valdane's main army is busy in the east, attacking a Lorod stronghold, so Reuchar crosses the Vergiri River, bringing the army of all Laror straight into Othrante, right into Valdane's home turf of BF.
And his campaign there. The sources describe extreme brutality.
Even by the standards of the time, yes. They capture Tregi, suffering heavy losses themselves, the sources note, but Lucert, the city of Lucert.
What happened there?
Total obliteration, and then the entire populace flayed, impaled on stakes amidst the ruins, a message of pure terror.
Unimaginable. So Bieth is invaded, ravaged. Valdane's family flees.
The Regimes flee north to Euronia. Valdane himself has to abandon his winning campaign against Lorod and rush back to face Roychar near Pyrrhus.
And there's a battle. The sources mention Valdane actually killed Roychar's marshal.
He did, Peldair ve Enstiri. Valdane personally vanquished him after Roychar strategically pulled back half his own army.
A feigned retreat.
Looks like it. A tactical withdrawal to lure Valdane in, because then 2 other Alliori forces swept in, encircled Valdane's army, and annihilated it.
And Valdane himself.
Captured.
Captured. And subjected to excruciating torture, the sources say, to make him reveal where his family's hidden treasures were.
So, the immediate result. Bieth is occupied by Roychar's forces. Lorod temporarily gets the upper hand against the other dukes.
Temporarily, yes. But the bigger picture, the long-term outcome, the sources stress. Roychar's kingdom, forged in this fire, is fast becoming the dominant power in the whole region. Preeminent Terosi power in Kaela.
It wasn't just external conquest, though. The sources give chilling details on how he maintained control inside Lor, preventing rebellion.
Absolutely. His methods were systematic. For instance, his lords, his captains. He never gave them large chunks of land altogether in one place.
Why not?
To stop them building a local power base, he scattered their fiefs, their land grants all over. Both sides of the Uliak, west, central, east, Lior. They got income, pensions, status, but no single area they truly controlled or could rally against him.
Smart, in a ruthless way, like that earlier ruler, Raphael the Wise, appointing lords to alien regions. Exactly the same principle, noted by the sources, complicate any attempt at local insurrection, make it incredibly hard for lords to connect with the people or organize.
And the cities. Especially smaller ones. How did he control them?
Often he'd just surround them with his army. Then he'd announce that the leading families, the Amatiniari, the traditional wealthy elites, were secretly conspiring with foreign enemies. Daconia, maybe Kaisdale. Then he'd incite the common folk of the city to rise up and massacre these leading families.
Incite murder.
Actively incite it. And the corpses were often left in the streets. A loyalty test for the survivors. If you participated, you were loyal. If not, you were suspect.
Was there, besides terror, was there a motive?
Oh, yes. An economic one. The citizens who joined the massacre got to keep half the wealth of their victims.
Half the wealth. So he's funding.
Yeah.
He's restructuring the whole economy around this.
Precisely. Dismantle productive trade, replace it with systematic persecution and murder of the affluent, encourage people to identify the wealthy, kill them, divide the assets.
Which eliminates rivals and funds his army.
Exactly. His 2 birds with one very bloody stone. And since Lior had a history of wealthy trade houses, the sources say Roychar, despite wrecking the old economy, rarely lacked resources for his armies. This new system constantly generated funds through terror.
Some called him the Destroyer, the sources say.
Understandably. And they also note, tellingly, that no prophesied child of light ever rose to challenge him. Suggests how total his control felt, maybe how deep the despair was.
Even his closest allies, his captains, they weren't safe either.
Not truly. He seized their families, claimed it was for their protection, but really, they were hostages. Well-fed prisoners.
And he moved them around constantly, like himself.
Just like himself. Never letting anyone get settled, always keeping them off balance, and the threat was crystal clear. Betray me, your family gets flayed and hung on trees, just like my enemies.
What if you were loyal? If you conquered territory for him?
Then you were rewarded. Though the reward itself was horrific. Unfettered license, the sources say, to murder, pillage, and loot within the territory you conquered. Your prize was the permission to inflict the same terror Roychar used.
What about the ordinary people who fled? The refugees going to Othrante, Kaysdale, even back to Daconia. Did he care?
Seemed completely untroubled by it, according to the accounts. He didn't see it as losing population. He saw them as potential pawns, people he might use later in his schemes.
So, after sorting things out in Othrante, temporarily at least, around 465 HKC, where does he turn next?
Back west, back towards his original enemy. He formally declares his intention, conquer Daconia itself.
And the implication is terrifyingly clear, isn't it?
Absolutely. Daconia, weakened, traumatized. They wouldn't be facing scattered rebels this time. They'd face the full, unified might of all Lior. A kingdom forged in blood, led by a man who believed unity required mass death.
Wow. What an intense period we've just walked through, from that crumbling empire, that fragmented rebellion.
To the meteoric rise of Roychar. Uniting Lior with incredible speed, yes, but also with just breathtaking, systematic brutality.
It's this total transformation, isn't it? From scattered regions to a single, formidable kingdom. But as these sources make so clear, it's a kingdom built on, well, on devastation.
Utter devastation. A ravaged land, unimaginable human suffering. That's the foundation.
The contrast is just so stark. His strategic genius, undeniably successful in forging unity, versus the methods.
Horrifying methods. Losing a quarter of his own people deliberately, almost philosophically. Wrecking the economy to fund his army through terror. Systematic brutality as a tool of government, not just war.
It leaves you with this chilling question, the one the sources seem to grapple with too. Given the devastation, the depopulation, the economy built on murder, can a kingdom built like that actually last?
Or maybe Rochar was right, at least about Lior. In the world these sources describe, stability there just breed discontent. Is this kind of extreme violence the only way to hold it together? What does that tell us about power itself?
A lot to chew on there. Definitely something to think about long after this deep dive ends.
Okay, let's unpack this. You've brought us quite a stack of source material here, specifically excerpts from Chapter 8 of Gair IV.
That's right.
And our mission today is really to dive deep into it. We want to pull out the most important insights, maybe some surprising details, and give you that shortcut understanding of this, well, pivotal historical period the text describes.
We are indeed. And the sources, they drop us right into the aftermath of King Gair III's death. That's 455 HKC.
Okay.
There's a succession crisis. Young Gair IV takes the throne, but, he's a minor.
Right, too young.
Exactly. So his mother, Bethrice Dorisina, she steps in as regent. It's a moment of, well, real vulnerability for Daconia. And it perfectly sets the stage for the conflict the text gets into.
And on the other side of that stage, you've got this figure rising in the east, Rochar Velisir.
Yes.
The sources show him emerging from Lior, unifying the land with incredible speed. What was it, 458 to 461 HKC?
Just a few years, yeah.
Yeah.
They describe him consolidating power as the text uses the phrase despotic tyrant king.
Strong words.
Very. And rapidly turning his new kingdom of all Lior into this dominant force in the east.
And once he's done that, finished that brutal consolidation, the text makes it pretty clear he immediately turns his attention west towards Daconia.
That's the pivot.
Yeah.
Our deep dive today is focused squarely on that turning point, his invasion of the easternmost Daconian duchy of Qualis. This is in 465 and 466 HKC.
Okay.
We're going to explore the strategies, the technology the source describes, and the profound human impact it had.
So Rochar finishes the Eastern Wars, becomes this undisputed power, and then, like you said, his attention locks onto Qualis. What does the source say about the initial Daconian response, those first incursions?
Well, the material describes these initial Liori attempts to cross the Qualan River, which, isn't actually that wide in places, maybe 60 feet. But the Daconian defense is scrambling. You have figures like Haldane of the House of Drain. He's fortifying castles along the border.
Okay.
And Lady Berselvi, Jane, the Duchess, she's trying to govern the duchy and coordinate the defenses at the same time.
But the text seems to put a lot of weight on Duke Cordior Dworzin, who happens to be Queen Regent Bethbrace's father, right?
Exactly. He becomes the central figure organizing the defense from within Qualis itself. The source notes he sets up his headquarters there.
Right on the front line, essentially.
Pretty much. He brings in troops from Lower Threum and works closely with Valkyrie Véchamboise to train up new forces.
Ah.
And the text even throws in this fascinating detail connecting their families. Queen Bethrace's son, King Gair IV, is actually wed to Valkyrie's granddaughter.
Oh, wow. So it highlights how these powerful families were all intertwined, even in the military command structure.
Yeah, it paints a picture of those alliances.
And the source paints a very striking picture of Cordior himself. 70 years old, suffering from, swellings and ulcers.
Yes, despite his age and afflictions.
Yet described as tirelessly assembling troops. What kind of force was he managing to pull together?
It's quite a mix, actually. It shows the breadth of Daconia's regions, picking in for this eastern defense. You've got archers from Ride, knights from Lefrais, pikemen from his own duchy of Voltai, and light cavalry from Daconia proper. He's rallying everyone he possibly can.
Okay, so let's talk about that first major assault. Fall of 465 HKC. General Andric Vivalesi leads, 14,000 all Liori troops assembled in Lamont?
That's the one.
What defensive preparations had Haldane of Qualis made? What does the source say?
Haldane's thinking strategically. He orders bridges destroyed along the river,
Makes sense.
and the land itself prepared with defenses, ditches, stakes, earthen forts, reinforcing the existing castles. It's a classic delaying action, make that river crossing as tough as possible.
And here's where the technology comes in. The source describes something new Rocher's army brings. These light catapults.
Yes, the Pranverori.
What details does the text give us about this weapon?
This is a really significant detail the source provides. These weren't your typical lumbering siege engines. They were specifically described as light catapults.
Okay.
Constructed from iron, bronze, and steel, using a spring mechanism and even a fuse for a fiery eruption. They hurled heavy scrap iron and stone.
And the text gives specifics. Range, rate of fire.
It does. A range of 1,200 feet and a rate of fire of 7 volleys an hour, which is pretty rapid for that kind of machine back then.
So the insight here isn't just the specs, but how this changed things. The source mentions they'd been used before in Ermanth and Othrante.
Right, in the Eastern campaigns.
But now they're turned on Daconia. What was their impact in that first assault?
Exactly. The strategic shift is key. These weren't just for smashing walls, though they could do that. Their aim was described as uncertain.
Interesting.
So they were targeting both fortifications and troop formations. The source says their terrifying force battered the western shore of the Quailan, forced the Daconians back.
Just by sheer firepower across the river.
Yes. And even destroyed a castle from the other side. This is what allowed Andrake to finally cross and establish a bridgehead.
So the new tech gives the Leoris that initial advantage. But the sources describe a Daconian counterattack. How did that play out?
The Daconians launched a night attack, very bold. Duke Cordier and his Voltine troops hit the Leori forces as they were crossing the river. Vulnerable moment.
Right in the middle of the crossing.
Meanwhile, Haldane led his remaining troops across the river downstream somewhere and hit the Leori rear. A classic pincer movement, really.
Yeah, it worked.
Spectacularly well, according to the text. It says Andrake's army shattered, and he himself fled like a thief in the night.
Wow, that's a pretty definitive description of a rout.
A complete reversal for that main Leori force. And the source notes Cordier didn't stop there. He followed up by marching on Castle Le Mans, which was Reucher's assembly point.
The base they'd just attacked from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And razed it before returning to his headquarters. A significant early victory for Daconia, showing really effective combined tactics.
But the Leoris, as the text puts it, were relentless. They didn't just pack up and go home, they tried another crossing.
They did. This time further north, at Liasol, on the Wiliac River.
Okay, different spot. What happened there?
This attempt was met by Daconian barges positioned in the river itself, carrying longbowmen, supported by the Knights of Qualis fighting from the shore.
So, riverine warfare, almost?
You could say that. And the conditions were apparently treacherous. The source mentions ice flows in the river.
Yikes.
Yeah. The cost was high on both sides. One Daconian barge sank, taking 300 Tarlani bowmen with it. A big loss.
Oh, terrible.
But the source claims 2,000 Gemma, all Leoris, perished trying to force that crossing. So the first year, 465, ends with Daconia holding the line, pushing back 2 major attempts. But it's clear Rochar isn't giving up.
No, definitely not. Now fast forward to 466 HKC the following year. The source describes the scale of the Leori force returning to Qualis, and it sounds, well, massive.
It's a completely different scale. The text mentions a fleet, 300 light galleys, and 100 barges. And crucially, those barges were equipped with the catapults, the Pranverori.
So they're bringing mobile artillery by river now.
Precisely. Sailing up the Uliak. And not just one army, but 2. All Leori armies gathered. One under Andrake again.
He gets another chance.
Apparently. And the other rumored, interestingly, to be commanded by Roychar himself. This is clearly meant to be the main event. The decisive blow.
And tragically for the Daconians, Duke Cordiar Dorazin isn't there this time.
No. The source notes his health failed over the winter. He died in Rulak from that festering stomach ulcer he'd been suffering from.
Right, the one mentioned earlier.
Queen Regent Bethrice was with him at the end, the text says. But interestingly, King Gair IV, her son, isn't mentioned as being present.
That's a detail.
Cordiar's son, Alvair III, takes over as Duke of Voltaire. But losing Cordiar right then, it's a critical blow at the worst possible moment. Daconia loses its most experienced commander in the east.
Just as the biggest threat arrives.
Exactly. So the sources then detail Andrake attempting another crossing, this time at the Rui Woods. He tries to feign an attack on Lament again, maybe draw defenses away.
Okay.
Haldane of Qualis meets him there with 10,000 Daconian troops. Fierce battles ensue at the crossing point.
But where does Reuter's main thrust come from if he is there?
This is where Reuter's strategic audacity, or perhaps, well, his recklessness, really comes through. The source says the true blow came from the south.
From the south? How?
Reuter led 15,000 all-Liori troops in this huge, sweeping maneuver over the southern highlands. Difficult terrain.
Over the highlands. With an army that size, how did they manage the equipment, those catapults?
That's another fascinating detail. They transported the disassembled spring catapults with them. The text mentions using cockatrices, which here means large draft animals, not the mythical beasts.
Oh, okay. Good clarification.
Along with oxen and mules to haul the parts over that rough ground. A huge logistical effort.
And the source mentions Reuter was heedless of supply lines and the cost on this march. What was the human price just to get that army into position?
It was steep. The text notes he lost 1,000 footmen just to starvation and the spring heat before they even descended onto Qualis west of the Jane River.
1,000 men lost before even seeing the enemy.
But it worked. It was the decisive flanking move.
And their target, Qualis itself. The text describes it as a prosperous province, nearly 160,000 inhabitants.
Yeah, rich prize.
And Rulok, its capital, Daconia's second largest city, 30,000 people, now completely exposed.
And Rulok wasn't just big, it was culturally significant. The source paints this picture of it being adorned with Gwenendori architectural wonders by the House of Drain.
Right, Haldane's family.
Yes, including a grand basilica with carvings resembling shells and corals, a nod to their western, maybe coastal heritage.
So this culturally rich, vulnerable city becomes the focus. What happens next?
The Alliors batters the walls with those catapults for 3 days. Then the sacking begins.
And the text is grim about the human cost.
Very grim. It specifies scribes, wealthy ammentiniari. The source implies these are key administrative and mercantile families.
The backbone of the city's function.
Pretty much. Many artisans and poorer ammentiniari are slain. Widespread killing.
But Reuter makes some specific choices about who and what he spares. This seems important.
It does. He spared those skilled in what the text calls useful crafts, engineers, architects, masons, blacksmiths, people he could presumably use.
Practical skills. Makes a kind of brutal sense.
And, maybe more surprisingly, he spared the Grand Basilica. The source says he was moved by its beauty.
Moved by beauty. This tyrant who just sacked the city. That's a fascinating contradiction mentioned in the text.
It is. Is the deeper insight here about calculated utility sparing skilled workers? Or maybe sparing the basilica for future propaganda, building his own legacy? Or maybe it was a genuine, albeit fleeting moment of aesthetic appreciation. The source doesn't explicitly say why, just that he did it.
And it had consequences, right? The source notes this spared basilica's architectural style.
Yes. It did later inspire similar structures back in Liori cities like Thuaricio. It actually gave rise to a whole new architectural style known as Liorex.
So quite literally, from the wreckage of Rulok, something new grows, architecturally speaking, directly linked to Reuter's choice.
It adds this layer of complexity to him, as presented in the text anyway. But let's not forget the military outcome. It's swift and brutal.
What happens to the Daconian army, Haldane's forces?
The Daconian army of Qualis is encircled and annihilated at the Battle of Thyrispe, utterly destroyed.
And the fate of those who surrendered?
The source is horrifyingly specific. 4,000 surrendered. They were forced to dig their own graves.
Oh, no.
Before being beheaded and buried in the trenches they just dug.
That's beyond warfare. That's calculated terror.
Exactly. And it gets even more chilling when the force describes the specific atrocity against the House of Drain, Haldane's family, the ones who built Rulok's beauty and tried to defend it.
What did Reuter do to them?
All the surviving male members of the House of Drain, right down to the youngest children, are captured and brought before Reuter. The source even notes a physical quirk of his, a twitch in his left eye as he presumably gave the order.
And the order was?
Devastating.
Oh.
The eyes of every single male Drain are gouged out. Even the children.
God.
The adults are then buried alive. The children are carried away in sacks and abandoned in different parts of Lior, to die alone, presumably, or perhaps be found and raised without name or sight.
It's aimed at extinguishing a lineage entirely. Absolute terror.
It's meant to send the most brutal message possible. Resistance leads to utter annihilation, the erasure of your family name. And this specific, maybe unprecedented brutality is the backdrop for one of the most remarkable stories the source mentions, Shereswe Rakurl, the Duchess of Ophiria.
Okay, what does the source say about her reaction to this?
Upon hearing about these atrocities, she takes this drastic, very personal action. She's 72 years old.
72!
She abdicates her position as Duchess, declares herself too old for conventional warfare.
Yeah.
She dons the garb of a Skydina, which sounds like some kind of established, maybe retired military or knightly order.
Right.
And just rides south, alone, initially.
Wow. What was her reasoning, does the text say?
It includes this incredibly poignant snippet of dialogue. Her successor, Divis, asks her why she's doing this, and her reply is chillingly direct. To atone for my mercy, I should have had the raven's throat slit in that lighthouse in Robavi.
The Raven. That must be Roysher.
Clearly, she's explicitly regretting some earlier encounter where she perhaps had a chance to kill him and didn't. Now, driven by that regret and the sheer horror of what he's done in Qualis, she's taking matters into her own hands, outside the normal structures of war and statecraft.
An assassination mission, essentially, born of regret and fury.
It seems so. And then the source says she just vanishes from history. Disappeared. Taking 9 retired commanders of her order, the Order of the Skydini, with her. Their stated goal, according to the text, seeking the life of the King of all Lior.
And we never find out what happened.
Her fate and theirs remains unknown, according to this source. Did they get close? Were they caught? Did they simply die trying? We don't know.
It's an incredible detail, a lone act of, what, desperate vengeance? Justice against this overwhelming power. It adds such a layer of human drama.
Absolutely.
Huh.
Defiance against the backdrop of large-scale tragedy. The source concludes this section by quantifying the human cost in Qualis overall. 40,000 people slain.
40,000. A catastrophic loss for the duchy.
Utterly devastating. And with Qualis now subjugated, crushed, the stage is set for the next even bigger conflict.
The capital itself.
Yes. The source ends this chapter, this section we've looked at, with King Roycher on his black steed, gazing across the river's vale in Weliok at Chrysalis, the Daconian capital.
Just think, only a decade or so earlier, Daconia basically ruled Lior.
And now Roycher stands at their gates. With a 30,000-strong Liori army, the siege of Chrysalis was about to begin.
A complete, and as the text shows, incredibly brutal reversal of power, driven by Roychar's ambition, that effective use of new tech, and just a willingness to employ terror on a scale we've just discussed.
A scale that provoked these desperate individual responses like Cheers We Recurls.
So hopefully this deep dive through the sources has given you a vivid, maybe a shortcut understanding of this violent and complex period. We've seen Roycher's rapid, brutal rise.
The desperate, ultimately failed defense of Qualis, led by figures like the aging Duke Courtier.
The impact of that terrifying new military technology, the spring catapults.
The devastating consequences for the people and nobility of Qualis, culminating in those horrific atrocities against the House of Drain.
And woven through all that large-scale destruction, we found that deeply human, almost mythic story in Curious Sweet Ray Carroll.
A figure who chose a path outside conventional means, a direct response to the scale of brutality described in the text.
It really leaves you with a provocative thought, doesn't it? Something to consider as you process these events from the source. What is the story of someone like Chiris, willing to abandon everything, her age, her position, conventional methods, just to pursue justice, or maybe vengeance, against a figure like Roychar? What does that tell us?
About the limits of conventional responses, or maybe the human capacity for reaction in the face of overwhelming systemic brutality.
Exactly. And what happens to those like Chiris and her companions who take such a perilous path and simply vanish from the historical record? It's something to mull over.
Okay, let's unpack this. You brought us a stack of sources, chronicles, notes detailing a really turbulent period in Daconia's history.
That's right. We're focusing on the capital, Chrysalis, and the events surrounding it.
This is after King Gair III succession crisis, right? So 455, 456 HKC.
Exactly. Leading to young Gair IV, with his mother, Bethrace Doricina, acting as regent.
But the real storm, it seems, was the rise of this newly united kingdom of Allur.
Under the tyrant Roychar V. Lucert, yeah. Daconia had been the regional power, controlling the Uliok River Valley, even Lior itself, for ages.
But rebellions changed that. Lior gained independence, and Roychar centralized power.
He did. Spend years consolidating in the east, and then, well, inevitably, he turned his eyes west.
Towards Daconia.
Straight towards Daconia.
Which brings us right to the Siege of Chrysalis, starting around 466 HKC. Daconia was suddenly fighting for survival.
It really was. So our mission, you could say, in this deep dive is to trace those key moments, the strategies, the surprising turns that defined this whole struggle using these sources.
It's quite a story. The scale sounds immense.
Absolutely. And even before the main siege, Reuter's campaign had, already laid waste to Qualis.
Right, and secure the province of Lower Threum. But the sources point to a big obstacle before Chrysalis itself.
The Vale River, a massive river. It wasn't just logistics, it was strategy.
They needed Scylla's castle.
Exactly. It controlled a key crossing.
Yeah.
And they absolutely had to deal with the Daconian fleet guarding the river.
And this fleet wasn't small. The sources describe it. 200 galleys.
200 plus those dreaded Tarlani barges, each carrying like 300 longbow archers.
Wow.
And bolstered by guild trade ships, fishermen's boats, all pulled into Chrysalis harbors. A real defensive force on the water.
A serious barrier. But the Liori command on Drake-Villissi, he was impatient. Reuter was back in Rulock.
Yeah. Reuter was consolidating. Andrakes was on the front line. And eager. His own people apparently suggested waiting for winter, maybe let the ice trap the fleet.
Makes sense.
But Andrik feared giving Daconia time to regroup after the losses they'd already suffered.
Meanwhile, inside Chrysalis, the Daconian commander, Gair IV, he was scrambling.
Making tough calls, he pulled troops from Lower Threum, leaving it more vulnerable to reinforce the capital.
That's a huge gamble.
It was, and he specifically summoned more elite Tarlani bowmen. He knew Chrysalis was everything.
Prioritizing the heartland. So, Andrake makes his move across the Vale. 2,000 infantry. Catapults.
A relatively small force, yeah. And the Daconian fleet did exactly what you'd expect. Sallied out, engaged, sank some ships.
But that wasn't the main attack.
No, it looks like it was a feint. The real thrust, according to these chronicles, was a combined Ilbaldi and the Liori galley force coming down from the north.
Using the currents.
Right, using the river's flow to swing around, outflank the Daconians, and cut off their retreat back to the harbors. Clever, but brutal.
And the naval battle itself sounds, well, vicious.
It does. Tarlani arrows raining down, but the Liori using flammable materials, setting the water ablaze in places.
Fire on the water.
And their heavy galleys, built for ramming, just smashed through the Daconian lines with iron and fire. The fleet was shattered. Decisive Liori victory on the river.
Oh, with the river clear.
3,000 all Liori soldiers land on Scylla Island, unopposed now. Their target, Scylla's castle.
And they start bombarding it immediately.
Right away. Light catapults from the river, from the land. But the castle, it held out for a while.
The sources mention the builders. Voltaire masons.
Yes, skilled masons from Voltaire. Apparently, their style, similar to Castron, meant thick, resilient walls. They withstood the initial pounding.
And the commander there, Haldane Vaudrain, he even fought back.
He did. Used captured Liori catapults against them. It held for 5 weeks, which is impressive under that kind of assault.
But it didn't fall to bombardment.
No. The sources describe treachery and this really chilling detail. A secret path through the sewers under the Uliok River.
Sewers? How do they manage that?
Liori soldiers, specially equipped. Oiled leather, iron, and glass masks. Imagine seeing that emerge from the filth and darkness.
That's nightmare fuel.
It worked. They got inside, the castle fell, and the defenders, well, the sources are blunt, butchered. Skins flayed, hung on the walls.
A deliberate terror tactic. Horrifying.
Utterly. But with Scylla's taken, the Liori controlled the rivers. The path to Chrysalis was wide open.
And then Drake brought his main army across. 24,000 troops.
The bulk of his force from Qualis, yes.
Duvaldi fell next, but the scholars got out.
Thankfully, yes. Iulis of Cresmere, the principal, ordered an evacuation of the scholars and books to Chrysalis just in time. A small mercy.
And then the Liori surrounded Chrysalis itself.
10 fortified camps, linked by palisades, ditches, the classic siege ring, tightening the noose.
Inside, Valkyra is still working, reinforcing walls, mounting captured catapults.
Trying, yes, though the sources note a key lack, the Liori igniting fuses for their projectiles, a technical edge for the attackers.
And then the main bombardment begins. 10th month, 466 HKC, 80 Liori catapults.
80, just imagine that. A relentless barrage.
Yeah.
Stones, metal, but also carcasses. Biological warfare, basically.
Awful.
Yeah.
What was life like inside?
Grimm doesn't even cover it, but the sources actually praise Regent Bethrice's leadership here.
Really? How so?
She organized evacuating women and children to the Ophiria Hills, brought citizens into the royal castle for safety, made sure they had beds, food, blankets, showed real grace under pressure, apparently, boosted morale.
That kind of presence must have mattered hugely in Valcaire.
Focused on the practical defense. Blacksmiths forging weapons from anything, metal signs, tableware, barrel hoops, expanding the militia, every able-bodied man pressed into service.
Just trying to keep them fighting.
A daily meal of thick soup. The strategy was just hold out, exhaust the enemy, wait for some kind of relief.
But the Leoris weren't starving.
Not at all. They were camped in Daconia's fertile lands, feeding off the bounty they'd conquered. A huge advantage.
And the Uvaldi allies were causing havoc elsewhere.
Brutal raids up the Vale River, plundering towns like Parekale, Cali, Tassi. Dove City became a base for raiding Voltai farmlands.
The sources mention huge numbers, 70,000 enslaved or killed.
70,000. It's a staggering number. Shows the conflict's devastation wasn't just confined to the capital.
All while Chrysalis is being pounded, walls reduced from 40 feet to 20.
The western walls, yeah. Though, interestingly, the lower sections, the original Voltaine work, held much better against the siege engines. Still strong.
Andrake must have been getting frustrated.
Extremely. The sources say he then ordered just all-out assaults, trying to break through by sheer force.
And these were costly, using prisoners.
Yes. Enslaved Uliniari forced to carry heavy wooden bridges across the moats, right into the teeth of the Tarlini longbows. Many were crushed or shot down. Horrific.
A complete disregard for life.
Utterly. But the Leori soldiers kept coming, swarming the moats with ladders, bridges. But the defenders, fueled by desperation, love for the city, they fought back like lions.
Using the rubble itself.
Jagged wall remains for cover, launching ambushes. They repelled wave after wave.
At great cost to the Leori, 4,000 lost in just 2 months.
That's what the chronicles claim. Bodies piled high beneath the walls, a grim picture of the defense's ferocity.
Andrake tried other tactics too, an attack across the ice.
Yeah, a winter gamble. Sent 2,000 men across the frozen Vale to hit the docks, maybe find a weak spot.
Did it work?
No. The defenders there are a real mix. Skydonai, Voltaine's, City Watch, citizens had put up palisades. They threw the attack back, again with heavy Leori losses.
But inside, the situation was dire. Famine.
Becoming critical. Even Regent Bethrice and Valcaire were feeling it. People resorted to eating leather, dogs, cats, rats, anything.
Unimaginable.
The poorest, the Nemestres, were making desperate runs across the icy Thrium River, trying to scavenge food from occupied territory. Suicidal, really.
And Andrake himself was under pressure.
Huge pressure. Not just military. The sources hint at personal ambition, fear of his uncle Roichar. He wanted the Leori throne. Capturing Chrysalis was key for his own political standing. Plus, there's a mention of him secretly hoarding gold looted from Celis, a dangerous secret to keep.
So he needed this victory badly. Personally.
Desperately. Which likely fueled his relentless attacks.
So, second month to 467 HKC. He changes tactics again.
Concentrates the firepower. All his remaining catapults, maybe 77 by then, focused on one single point in the weakened wall.
Just pounding it relentlessly.
For days. Until finally, a breach, a gap opened over the piled bodies from earlier assaults. A horrific way into the city.
And he ordered an immediate assault.
Into the new city district. The initial rush was repelled, but the Leori found another way in elsewhere. They swarmed into the streets.
So it becomes street fighting. Brutal.
Absolutely. And with the outer walls breached, Andrake started building siege towers inside the city, aiming to bombard the royal castle itself. It looked like the end for Chrysalis.
But then news from the west.
Exactly. Trouble for Andrake. Word arrives that his Ildvaldi allies were being pushed back, driven from Doves, retreating from other towns along the Vale.
A shift in the wider war.
And more importantly, as spring arrived in 467, an army was gathering in Kresmir by Lake Varia.
An army to relieve the city.
Preparing to march east and challenge the Leori invaders. The siege, it turns out, was far from over.
So the decisive confrontation shifts outside the city walls.
Right. This army at Kresmir, led by Didas Veracurl and Alver Doirison, forces from Voltai and Ophiria.
Joined by riding bowmen too.
1,500 of them, yeah. A significant force building. But Andrake's army, despite its losses, was still formidable.
So the Daconian lords waited, for another ally.
An ally coming from a very unexpected direction. The sources mention the treacherous high mountains between Rhyden and the Spine Range, difficult terrain.
And this ally was?
The Gwenandoran warriors. Their vanguard reached Cresmere, joining the Daconians.
And this combined force, the Army of the Sunset Lands, started marching,
Gathering volunteers as they went, heading straight for Chrysalis.
forcing Andric's hand.
He had to react. Morning of the 18th of Veodi, 467 HKC, the All-Leori halt their assault inside Chrysalis, which had been raging for nearly a week by then,
Pulled back.
retreated to Pristine Hill, west of the city, to turn and face this new threat.
Okay, the battlefield is set. How did the armies line up?
The Daconian host, Voltae and Ophiria in the center. On the flanks, 10,000 knights from Carolir by the sea.
10,000, that's a huge contingent.
Massive. And hidden behind them, another 6,000 Caroleri, including Tarlane archers with their true bows, suggests superior quality.
And the Leori?
Still in their black armor, advancing slowly, disciplined columns of heavy pikemen, crossbowmen, Ildvaldi forces guarding their flanks, looked like a standard clash of the era.
But then, the surprise.
The big reveal, the Daconian center parts, and out comes something the Leori had apparently never seen before.
What was it?
600 tricorn bulls, ridden by warriors from the half-ogreish Gwenandori kingdom of Nuith by the Rock.
Tricorns, mounted. 600.
The sources say the ground trembled when they charged.
Describe these tricorns.
30 feet long, leathery hide, tails like crocodiles, heads with colorful crests and 3 lethal horns. And they were armored.
Armored bulls.
Armor made by dwarven smiths from Carolir. Gleaming turquoise silver, matching the Carolari knights, integrated war beasts.
Incredible. What was the impact of their charge?
Utterly devastating. The sources say they were unstoppable once roused. Arrows, fire, swords couldn't halt them. Leori and Ilvaldi arrows just made them angrier.
So he just plowed through.
Tore through the black armored Leori lines. Then the Gwenandoran riders themselves crashed in, their armor shining, shattering the Leori knights, driving the pikemen back towards Chrysalis itself.
And the defenders inside the city.
Saw their chance, poured out of the gates, hitting the reeling Leori army from behind.
Caught in a pincer.
Exactly. Between the army of the Sunset Lands and the city's defenders, the All-Leori army broke, routed completely.
A total victory for the allies.
Decisive. The Ildvaldi and about 1,000 Leori escaped. But 3,000 all-Leori soldiers were left behind, captured.
And what happened to the prisoners?
Grimly, many were killed almost immediately. Daconians seeking vengeance for Qualis and the siege horrors?
Understandable, perhaps, but brutal.
Very. But then the Caroleri commander intervened. She dismounted from her, get this, armored cockatrice.
An armored cockatrice, seriously.
That's what the chronicles say. Removed her helm, it was Tuscalane the 18th, queen of Carolir by the Sea herself.
The queen was there in person.
Leading her forces, she ordered the Daconian lords to stop the slaughter of the remaining prisoners.
Why was she there?
She had answered an ancient alliance pact, invoked by Regent Bethrice when Voltae, part of Daconia, was in peril.
So Bethry's diplomacy brought them in.
It seems so, and it was clearly Tuscalane's forces, especially the Gwenandoran shark troops, that secured the victory. It was Tuscalane's triumph, really.
A tide-turning victory. But there's a catch.
A significant one. The sources state quite clearly that this very victory, the one that saved the city, marked the beginning of the end for Bethrace's regency. Within a year, she was out.
Why? Why would saving the city lead to that?
The reason given is incredibly brief, but loaded. For the Gwenandoran are not Tyrosi.
Not Tyrosi. That was the reason.
That's the stated reason. It hints at some very deep cultural or political divisions.
So let's try and sum this up. We've seen this incredibly brutal siege. Reuter's methodical advance, the fall of Silas through, well, sewer infiltration.
The grinding bombardment, the starvation inside Chrysalis, the desperate defense against overwhelming odds, Andric's own pressures driving him.
And then the sudden reversal. The arrival of the Army of the Sunset Lands.
The intervention of Queen Tuscalane, Carolira's power, and especially those Gwenandoran tricorn riders. Unbelievable force multiplier.
They shatter Reuter's main western army, save the capital. An immense victory bought at terrible cost.
Absolutely. But then there's that political fallout for Regent Bethrice, the one who orchestrated the alliance that saved them.
And this is maybe the most fascinating takeaway buried in the sources. That bringing in the non-Tyrosi Gwenandoran, crucial as they were, is cited as the reason her regency ended.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What does that tell us about the political landscape, the cultural sensitivities of these Tirosi kingdoms like Daconia and Caroline?
Even when facing annihilation from someone like Rochar, bringing in certain kinds of allies had profound internal consequences.
That phrase, not Tirosi, clearly carried enormous weight. It suggests alliances, even necessary ones, could cross lines that threaten the established order or identity.
Definitely something to mull over as you digest this incredible, complex history. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Okay, today we are plunging into what I think is a really fascinating historical moment. A time of, well, near total collapse, and then this completely unexpected salvation for the Kingdom of Daconia. We're talking mid-5th century High King's Calendar.
Exactly. And our main source material for this dive is going to be excerpts from a specific text, chapter 11, on the Gwenandoran Grand Embassy. It really zeroes in on the events right after the siege of Chrysalis, the capital. A very dramatic period.
Right. And our mission here is to, really dig into this chapter. We want to unpack what happened, the politics, sure, but also the cultural clashes, the personal stuff, and figure out why this seemingly impossible alliance happened and, well, what it all meant. Where did it lead? So let's get into it.
Okay, let's start by setting the scene. Daconia's troubles. So Daconia, at this point, it's a big deal among the Tirosi kingdoms. Really important. They controlled the Wiliak River Valley, the middle part, and the region of Lior. Very strategic.
But things weren't exactly smooth sailing, were they? The source points to a succession crisis after King Gair III died. That was 455, 456 HKC. His grandson, Gair IV, takes the throne, but he's young. It's his mother, Bethrace Dorcina, who's actually running things as regent.
Yeah, a formidable figure, Bethrace. And it's right around then, during this political instability, that the situation in Lior just explodes. It had been simmering, rebellions through the 440s, 450s.
Yeah.
But the source marks 457 HKC as the moment it becomes a full-blown general uprising.
And the result for Daconia was, well, catastrophic, wasn't it?
Totally. They lost Lior, gone, and Lior doesn't just, drift off. It unites. Under this figure, the source calls Rochar Velusert, paints him as a terrible tyrant and conqueror. He forms the kingdom of all Lior.
Wow. Okay, so a new, unified, and seemingly aggressive power right on their border.
Exactly. And Rochar, according to our source, doesn't waste any time, finishes up his wars in the east, and then turns right around, heading west, straight for Daconia.
Which brings us to the absolute crisis point. By 466 HKC, Roichar's army is at the gates of Chrysalis, the capital itself. And Queen Mother Bethrace is inside, trying to hold it all together. You can just imagine the desperation.
Oh, absolutely. The source doesn't hold back. It talks about flames of war scorched the city. Near 10,000 souls had perished. Just brutal fighting within the walls. By early 467, it really looked like game over for Chrysalis, for Daconia.
But then the cavalry arrives. Almost literally, at the very last second, the source says Chrysalis and Daconia are saved. And the rescuers, forces from the Gwenandoran kingdom of Carolire. Completely unexpected.
Unexpected and incredibly controversial.
Hugely controversial.
Yeah. The source uses that word abhorrent. That's how many Daconians saw it. So why was getting help from the Gwenandorans so bad?
Well, it boils down to this massive cultural and religious divide. Daconia is Tarosi, monotheistic, follows the hierarchy-based, way over in Ilium. The Gwenandoran, they're matriarchal, polytheistic, just fundamentally different. Alien, even offensive to many Tarosi.
Okay, so deep-seated animosity there. Given that, why did Carolire show up? It wasn't just random kindness, was it?
No, not at all. The source points to something deeper, a long-standing, maybe not very public alliance between the Gwenandoran queens of Carolire and Bethrace's own family, House Dorison.
Ah, House Dorison of Voltae.
Exactly. There's this history, apparently, where Voltae once owed fealty to the Gwenandoran High Queen, and the source hints Bethrace had been, let's say, quietly working those connections for years.
So it wasn't just luck. It was Bethrace playing a long game, relying on these old, perhaps controversial ties. That explains the unexpected deliverance then. Unexpected to most, maybe, but not to her.
Right. So the siege is lifted, chaos averted for now. What happens next?
Well, the Lior side, represented by Andrik Vevolasi, who the source notes is King Roichar's nephew, he seeks a truce with the Daconian lords. Time to talk.
Okay. And you'd think that Daconias, with these powerful Gwenandoran allies right there, would be pushing hard, maybe trying to take back lost ground.
Some definitely wanted to. The source says some nobles were keen to recapture Qualis, likely including the city of Salus. They felt, emboldened.
But they didn't. Why not?
Couple of key reasons mentioned. One, Daconia had no fleet. None. Couldn't control the sea passage, the Vale, which was vital. And maybe more importantly, Queen Tusslane of Carolire, the Gwenandoran commander, seems to have acted, well, of her own accord, the source says, without the official okay from her mother, the High Queen.
Ah, so maybe her authority wasn't absolute, or she couldn't commit to a bigger war?
Possibly. It suggests her position might have been a bit tenuous, limiting how much more she could do right then.
So, no big counterattack. Instead, they sign a ceasefire. What were the terms?
A key point, according to the source, was that Silas was supposed to be returned to Daconian rule.
Supposed to be? I sense a but coming.
You sense correctly. The Lioris, well, the source calls them treacherous in their hearts. They didn't hand Silas back. Instead, they dug in, fortified it, seized the harbor, brought in their own ships, flat out broke the truce.
Wow. Okay, so Daconia is stuck. They got saved, but they can't actually push the enemy out of this key city.
Exactly. A really frustrating position. The source notes the main upside for them was just getting the Wuliok River reopened for trade, which, after a war like that, was probably vital, but still.
Still felt like a loss, I imagine.
Probably. But it's interesting what Queen Tusslane did. In response to the Lioris betrayal, she made a point. The source highlights this. She decreed Gwenandoran merchants were forbidden, absolutely forbidden, from trading with the Leoris and Silas on that occupied Daconian soil.
So taking a clear side, even if she couldn't fight more battles for them.
Right, a symbolic and practical stand with Daconia.
Meanwhile, you've got this Gwendoran army just hanging around.
Pretty much. They spent the winter camped near Duvalda University, sort of guaranteeing the peace, but also being a very visible, very different presence.
And that leads to friction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Cultural clashes.
Oh, definitely. The source talks about the different Gwenandoran religious orders, the Amatiniari and Ventinari. Their customs just bewildered the Daconians.
Let's focus on the Ventinaras for a sec. The priestesses. The source gives some vivid descriptions. Beautiful, graceful, like courtesans almost. But with this lack of modesty that confounded the Daconian populace, their very way of being was shocking.
It sounds like it. And then you get the summer solstice celebration. The Gwenandoran hold this festival near some old elven stones, and it's described as joyous abandon. There's pink mead poured from seashell horns, flowers, music, singing.
And public displays of affection, which the source calls licentious acts.
Exactly. Totally counter to Daconian norms.
But here's the really interesting bit the source mentions. It wasn't just the Daconians being shocked. Some younger Daconians, Lineari, maybe students, they were actually captivated. They joined in.
Yeah, which apparently caused great dismay among the Daconian Ventinaras at the university. The Tyrosi establishment, they saw it as dangerous, as embracing the heresies of the Gwenandoran. So this cultural contact wasn't just external, it was creating ripples inside Daconia.
Fascinating. Okay, this all builds towards a really pivotal moment, a big formal reception at the royal castle in Chrysalis. Queen Tislaine and her people are received with full honors.
And it's a big deal. King Gair IV himself is there, which was apparently rare. And significantly, there's also an emissary from all Lior present, a reminder of the ongoing threat right there in the room.
High stakes. The source even says this gathering would later echo through the annals of history.
And the absolute core of it, the part that echoes, seems to be a private conversation. Queen Tislaine and Queen Mother Bethrice sitting together next to the king, talking quietly in the Gwenandoran language.
And the source adds this ominous note. Bethrice herself later wrote about this talk, hinting it might have been what led to her untimely demise but a year later.
Chilling. It tells you just how explosive the topic must have been.
So what was discussed? What was so dangerous? The source lays out Tislaine's argument. She starts brutally honest. Your son's kingdom rests upon a drifting board. Basically, Daconia is incredibly weak.
And she reminds Bethrice of the cost to Carolire. 1,000 of our sons and daughters now rest within the soil of Daconia. We paid a price to save you. And she says Reuter attacked because he perceived your weakness.
Okay, laying it bare. Then comes the choice.
Yeah, a stark choice. Tislaine says Daconia either has to somehow match Lior's strength, which she basically says is impossible, you just don't have the numbers, or you have to align with a greater power.
Find a powerful protector. And Bethrice's reaction.
Well, she's sharp. She brings up the Amatiniari wanting the Road of Pearls, reminds Tislaine of House Woltai's old loyalty. But then she asks, okay, this greater power, who? She points out the problem. Any likely allies, like Kaisdale, are across the Yuliak River through Reuter's territory. How do we even reach them? She sees the trap.
Smart. And Tislaine's answer?
Tislaine plays that history card again, but bigger this time. She says, essentially, remember, before Garthair, Voltai itself used to be part of the Gwenandoran High Queendom.
Hitting close to home, implying Voltai should return.
That's how Bethrice seems to take it. The source says a shadow crossed her face. She pushes back. Hard. No, these are different days. We're Daconians now. One people, one union. Voltai stays with Daconia. It's a clear assertion of Daconian identity over that old family loyalty.
But Tislaine wasn't talking about just Voltai, was she?
No, that's the moment. Tislaine puts her hand on Bethrice's arm, leans in and clarifies, not Voltai Daconia.
Wow, the whole kingdom. She's proposing Daconia itself align with the Gwenandoran.
Exactly. And Bethrice, she grew pale, totally shocked. She immediately states the obvious massive roadblock. My queen, Daconia is a Tyrosi land, and Chrysalis is the seat of a Tyrosi matriarch. Religion, culture, identity, how could this possibly work?
A fundamental conflict. How does Tislaine respond to that?
She comes back with some pragmatic points. First, she argues Tyrosi people already live freely in Gwenandoran lands, keeping their own customs. It's possible. Second, the hard geopolitics. If Lior keeps growing, Daconia's future has to be with the West, with the Gwenandoran. There's no other option. She even points out Chrysalis is physically closer to Carolyre than it is to Ilium, the Tarosi holy city.
Interesting geographical argument.
Right, and she drives home the pattern. Trouble comes from the east, wealth and safety from the west. Carolyre saved you this time.
And the final offer. The big promise.
Immense security. Teslain states it clearly. If the king of Daconia swears allegiance to the High Queen, then no future conqueror from the east would escape the wrath of the 22 kingdoms of the Gwenandoran. Total protection, basically. But the price? Allegiance. Sovereignty. A potential shattering of their identity.
An absolutely monumental proposal. And the source adds one more layer right at the end of this conversation description, doesn't it? Something personal.
Yeah, it's quite intriguing. It says Teslin leaned close to Bethrice as if to whisper a secret.
And immediately rumors started.
Right. The source notes, some who attended the banquet claimed they saw them kiss.
A kiss between the two queens. And the source even names a supposed witness.
It does. A young knight of the royal guard, interestingly, of Liori origin, named Pedaine Vasilier. He'd apparently served Bethrice's relative and returned with him. So maybe he was positioned to see something. Or maybe he had his own reasons for spreading such a rumor. It adds this layer of potential scandal and political intrigue right on top of everything else.
So wrapping up this deep dive, what a story the source lays out. You have a kingdom on its knees, rescued by an ally many found abhorrent.
Yeah, and that rescue doesn't solve things. It leads to a shaky truce, these intense cultural encounters causing divides within Daconia, and then this incredibly high-stakes negotiation.
Centered on Queen Mother Bethrice.
Yeah.
Caught between the absolute need for survival, pulling on those ancient, maybe dangerous family ties, and the very core of what Daconia was, its Tarosi faith and identity.
And that chilling hint from the source that this very conversation might have cost Bethrice her life just a year later. It really underlines the risks she was taking, the forces she was dealing with.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about that conflict between survival and identity. How far can a society bend? What alliances can it make? When threatened before it breaks or becomes something else entirely? Especially when the potential ally represents, well, the opposite of your core beliefs.
Absolutely. And then there's that final whisper of rumor from the source. How much can the personal, a supposed secret, a claimed kiss, maybe true, maybe gossip, maybe deliberate disinformation spread by someone like that Liori knight, how much can that shape the course of history, the fate of kingdoms? It's something to ponder long after we finish talking about the sources.
Okay, let's dive deep into a real historical puzzle today. It's wrapped in quite a bit of mystery.
Definitely. We've got some fascinating source material here, excerpts from chronicles.
Right, things like chapter 12, and there's the Chronicle of Gair IV as well.
And our goal really is to unpack what these old texts tell us.
And maybe, what they don't tell us, what they hide about this very enigmatic figure, King Gair IV of Daconia.
Yeah, and we want to make this deep dive useful for you, give you those key insights quickly, whether you're prepping for something or just, curious.
Exactly. No getting lost in the weeds. So where do we start? The context, I guess.
Yeah, gotta set the stage. To get Gair V, you need to understand his world. The sources put us mid-5th century HKC, High King's Calendar.
And Daconia at this time.
Yeah.
It's a big deal, right?
Oh, yeah. A powerhouse among the Tarosi kingdoms. They dominated the Uliok River Valley, Lior. Important territories.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The sources mentioned trouble.
Definitely not smooth. There were rebellions simmering in Lior for a decade or more. The 440s, 450s.
And then it boiled over.
Big time. 457 HKC, a general uprising.
And the result, according to these accounts?
Daconia lost Lior. Lost it. And Lior didn't just break away, it united. Became the kingdom of all Lior.
Under Roishar Viluserd, the sources aren't very flattering about him, are they?
No, one chronicle calls him a terrible tyrant, and he wasn't done. After some wars in the east, he looked west.
Towards Daconia.
Directly towards Daconia. By 466 HKC, his armies were actually besieging the capital, Chrysalis.
Wow. So the capital itself was under threat. Desperate times.
Absolutely desperate. The city was on the broke. The defense was being led by the regent, Queen Mother Bethrice Dorvicina.
Bethrice, okay, Gair's mother.
Exactly. And the chronicles say the city, the whole kingdom really, was only saved by an intervention, unexpectedly, in early 467 HKC.
An intervention. From who?
This is where it gets complicated and controversial, according to the sources. The help came from the Gwenandoran kingdom of Carolar.
Led by their queen, Tuslan.
Right. And while this saved Chrysalis, many Daconians apparently found it. Well, the word used is abhorrent.
Why abhorrent? Just because they were foreign?
It was the religion. The Daconians were strictly Tarosi, monotheistic. The Gwenandoran followed a different faith entirely. So accepting help from them, it was a big deal.
I see. A necessary evil, maybe, but still controversial.
Precisely. And this whole situation led to a major event in Chrysalis that same year, 467 HKC. The Grand Embassy.
A big diplomatic gathering.
Huge. And significantly, it was during this embassy that the king of Daconia himself, Gair IV, made one of his extremely rare public appearances.
Ah, so this brings us closer to the man himself.
Yeah.
Or the mystery of him.
Exactly. King Gair IV and what the sources call the Long Regency.
Okay, break that down. He became king when?
After his grandfather Gair III died in 455 HKC. There was some kind of succession crisis first, but then Gair IV took the throne.
And the regency part.
Well, crucially, the sources point out he turned 15 in autumn 456 HKC.
And 15 was the age of majority in Daconia.
Correct. Legally, he was an adult. The regency should have ended then. His mother, Bethrice, should have stepped down as regent.
But she didn't.
She didn't. That's the core puzzle. In 467 HKC, the year of that embassy, Gair V is about 26.
26.
Yeah. And the regency under his mother had been going on for 11 years past its legal expiry date.
Wow. Okay. What did the sources say about Bethrice? Was she power-hungry or...
They actually portray her pretty positively. Beloved by many in Chrysalis, respected for her competence. Seems she handled the crisis years well.
So she was capable, but still, 11 extra years.
Exactly. So, as things calmed down after the siege, the sources say people started asking questions. Whispering, maybe.
Why is Bethrice still in charge? Where is the king?
Precisely. The accounts strongly suggest something was unusual about the king himself.
Which leads us to his seclusion.
Yes. The sources are quite specific here. He lived inside the royal castle in Chrysalis, but was seldom seen, even by nobles.
And it got worse over time.
Apparently so. His appearances just got rarer and rarer.
Do they say why? The reason for the seclusion?
They admit the exact reasons are lost to time. Frustrating, isn't it? But they do give details about his condition and his life inside the castle.
Okay, like what?
They mention his great physical size and that it increased with age, making it hard for him to move.
So mobility issues.
Seems so. He was apparently always seen being carried like in a palanquin or sitting in a massive throne-like chair and always wearing heavy robes.
Hiding his form, perhaps.
Possibly. The sources also record Bethrice's explanation for his, swollenness, as they put it.
What was her story?
She claimed he'd been poisoned at age 3 by someone named Dionys. Whether that's true or just, a convenient story, we don't know.
Right, a potential cover. And where did he live within the castle?
In the southern wing with his mother. They apparently expanded their royal apartments quite a bit, took over 3 whole floors eventually.
3 floors. Just for the 2 of them and staff.
Seems like it. And the security was intense.
How so?
The sources describe it as heavily guarded, sentinels everywhere, and ventineros stationed throughout.
Ventineros? They're like a monastic order, aren't they?
Yes, specifically the Brothers of Sage Joram, known for their vow of eternal silence.
Silent guards and attendants.
Primarily attendants, it seems. Populating those floors, serving the king, along with a few female ventineros for his personal needs. Access was incredibly restricted.
Who could actually see him?
According to the chronicles, none but Bethrice and a very select few of her closest confidants. That's it.
Wow. So, a king, but hidden. Physically impaired, maybe. Living in this guarded, silent environment.
It paints a picture of, significant impairment and maybe control or protection. It's hard to say for sure.
But despite all the secrecy, the sources do offer a few glimpses, don't they? Some really strange anecdotes.
They do, and these are some of the most striking details we have, really bizarre little moments.
Like the courtier who got lost.
Yeah, a noble woman lost in the castle corridors at night, and she apparently stumbled upon the king.
What did she see?
She describes seeing Gair V waddling through the hallways. Waddling, and clinging to the source calls it a wheeled contraption resembling a scaffold.
A scaffold?
Yeah.
Like for walking.
The description says it encircled him like a child's playpen. Just try to picture that. A huge man waddling using this wheeled frame.
That is an image. A very strange one.
Isn't it? And there's another glimpse, this one from a Ventanero, but importantly, not one of the silent ones.
Okay.
He was on an errand for Vivaldi University and got led to the royal apartments by mistake.
Oh, an accidental witness. What did he see?
He apparently saw the king being bathed,
Okay.
and he also got a look inside the king's bedchamber. Described it as having a massive but low bed, soft rug on the floor, and toys.
Toys for a grown man.
Scattered across the floor, yes, but not just scattered. The source is oddly specific. They were arranged in a line, forming a serpentine procession.
A procession.
Yeah, with the smallest at the front and the largest at the back, like a little parade of toys.
That's incredibly specific. And weird. The wheeled walker, the toy parade. It hints at something quite childlike, doesn't it?
It certainly raises questions about his mental state, alongside the physical descriptions. A confined world, perhaps very different from a typical royal existence.
Did he ever appear in public properly beyond that one embassy feast?
The sources mention occasional visits to the Basilica of Saint-Laurent for religious services.
What was he like there?
He'd sit in silent dignity, apparently, just listening to the AC choirs. That's their sacred music.
Silent dignity. So composed.
Seemingly. But there's this one remarkable detail. It says, when the voices of the Ventanera adepts, the female singers, really soared, a light seemed to fall upon the king's eyes.
A light?
Yeah. And he'd look up, as if the ceiling had vanished and he was communing directly with the All-Father, their God, and he'd raise his swollen hands in reverence.
So, moments of seeming connection, or piety at least. Silent but connected.
It seems like those moments in the Basilica were his only real visible, if silent, interactions with anything beyond his apartments.
So these glimpses, the waddling figure, the toys, the gaze in the Basilica, they're almost all we have of him, physically.
Almost. Because there is one more crucial piece. The only time King Gair IV is actually recorded speaking.
Ah, right. The conversation at the feast.
Exactly. Remember that grand embassy in 467 HKC? An emissary from Al-Yor, Aldainvi Mizizir, was there.
He was given the honor of sitting next to the king.
To his left, yes. A rare privilege. And he recorded the scene. Gair being fed chicken and fish by his attendants, drinking only sweetened water, mostly silent. Until, according to Aldain, the king slowly turned his head toward Lord Aldain.
And spoke. What was his voice like?
Aldain's description is striking. He said it was so small and high-pitched that it seemed a lesser creature spoke from within his vast body.
Wow. And what did this small voice say?
He asked Aldain, do you know what?
Okay. Bit of an odd opener. How did Aldain reply?
Taken aback, he just said, no, your grace.
And then, the king's words.
This is it. The only recorded exchange, he said. My grandfather was king. He was a king. King of Daconia. King. Do you know it? That my grandfather was king. He was king of Daconia. And he was named Gair, too, like me. Did you know that? That he was named Gair, and he was king.
Repetitive. Focused entirely on his grandfather being king.
That is the entire recorded conversation. Full stop.
Just repeating king, about his grandfather.
Yeah. And the chronicles use this exact account to really hammer home his status as, quote, most enigmatic and reclusive. His life and reign shrouded in mystery. This single strange interaction is all we have of his voice.
It certainly adds another layer to the picture of potential cognitive impairment, doesn't it?
It strongly suggests it, alongside the toys and perhaps the need for constant attendance. But what's fascinating is how these fragmented pieces, even without a clear diagnosis, raise big questions for the kingdom.
Like the succession issue.
Exactly. Yeah. The sources make a point of mentioning the lack of heirs. King Gair and his queen, Nimprice, who was nearly 24, had no children.
And that mattered because...
Because if Gair died without issue, the throne wouldn't pass simply. It would go to his nephews.
Nephews, plural.
Raphael Veyre-Karl and Roland Wehtaufen. And crucially, they were from rival noble houses.
Ah, so potential conflict baked right in.
Deep animosity already existed between their families, the sources say. So, a vacant throne with those two as potential heirs. The chronicles clearly saw it as a recipe for disaster, future conflict.
So the king's condition, his seclusion, his lack of heirs, it wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political problem, a stability risk.
A huge one. So if we pull back and look at what the chronicles consistently describe.
Yeah, what's the overall picture they paint?
Great physical size, difficulty moving, the mother's poisoning story, the extreme seclusion, the guards, the silent attendance, restricted access.
The weird glimpses like the walker and the toys, the silence, except for that one strange, repetitive conversation.
Right. Taken together, the sources consistently suggest a king who, despite being an adult, was severely limited. Physically, yes, but also possibly cognitively.
And kept completely out of sight and seemingly out of power.
Pretty much. The governance seems to have stayed firmly with Bethrice. The sources don't give us a label, no medical term, obviously.
No, of course not. But the description is cumulative, isn't it? It points towards someone who just couldn't function as a monarch in any typical way.
Exactly. And the reasons why are debated even within the sources themselves, like, was the poisoning story real or a fabrication to justify the situation?
Which is why these accounts are still so compelling, right? Because they make you, the listener, think.
Absolutely. What does it tell you about how power works in a royal court when the actual monarch is, for all intents and purposes, absent?
Or what it suggests about attitudes towards disability back then. Or maybe the lengths people like Bethrice perhaps would go to maintain control or protect the lineage, or maybe even protect Gair himself.
It forces you to look past the title king and consider the human reality, maybe a tragic one, that these texts hint at.
Yeah. It's fascinating and kind of sad, too.
And so, the enigma of Gair V just endures. He's a king, defined more by these strange descriptions of his seclusion
The guards, the silence, those few bizarre glimpses.
than by anything he actually did as a ruler.
The big paradox just hangs there, legally an adult. But the regency went on for more than a decade. A king hidden away.
Never truly seen, never exercising power in public.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something for you to really mull over, based directly on what these sources describe.
What does it actually mean to be a king if you're never seen by your subjects, you never make a ruling, and the only words anyone ever recorded you saying are about how your grandfather was king?
Yeah. What were the real power dynamics? What was truly going on behind those guarded doors in the royal castle of Chrysalis during Gair V's long, hidden reign? Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into a pretty intense period for the kingdom of Daconia. We're focusing on the final years of King Gair IV, which are, well, deeply mysterious, and also the complex regency that came right before his end.
That's right. And for this deep dive, we've gathered some key historical accounts. We're looking at excerpts from Gair IV, chapter 13 for context, and crucially, the chronicle of the end of the regency and the final years of Gair IV. That one really gets us into the political thick of it.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission really is to unpack these sources. We want to figure out who the main players were, understand the, frankly, huge challenges Daconia faced then, and trace the events that will fundamentally reshape the kingdom during this really critical time.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We're talking mid-5th century HKC, that's the High King's calendar, just the historical year count they use. Daconia had been a major power, controlling a big river empire, but then, bam, the rebellion in Lior in 457 HKC, everything changed.
They lost their whole downstream empire, didn't they? It just collapsed for them.
Pretty much. And Lior came together under this guy, Roichar Lucert. He built this large tyrannical kingdom called All Lior.
So Daconia's left reeling. A major power, suddenly much smaller, much weaker.
Exactly. And in the middle of this crisis, the kingdom's being held together by Regent Bethrice Doricina. She's the king's mother. She had to step in because, well, the sources are pretty clear. Gair IV was severely impaired, just couldn't rule effectively himself.
So Bethrice walks into this almost impossible situation. The sources say she governed as well as anyone could, really. And initially, she actually kept some popularity, despite, losing Lior and the whole kingdom being in crisis. But then she makes a decision that really shakes things up.
Ah, yes, her crucial alliance, and highly controversial, too, with the pagan Gwenandoran. And this wasn't just some political agreement on paper. The sources are quite clear. The Gwenandoran army literally saved Chrysalis, the Daconian capital, from a Liori siege in 467 HKC.
Okay, so they saved the city, survival secured. But what was the cost, politically? What did this alliance do to Bethrice's standing inside Daconia?
It significantly damaged her support, particularly with the Ventinari.
They're the sort of traditional spiritual and landowning caste, right? Powerful group.
Very powerful and deeply suspicious of outsiders, especially, people with a different faith. The Gwenandoran were definitely pagan compared to the Ventinari's established religion.
So the very act of saving the city with these allies immediately creates this huge internal rift, especially with the religious establishment.
Absolutely. And you see this reflected right away in the royal court.
How so?
Well, right after that Gwenandoran alliance is made, big changes. The Chancellor, a Ventinera named Amaris, she's out, replaced by Count Debrian Venanatici. And what's really interesting, the sources point out Debrian knew the Gwenandoran language. He'd even lived in Carolire, their lands.
So that's not just changing a person, that's signaling a whole shift in focus, isn't it, towards these new allies?
Precisely. And then there's tragedy compounding things. The treasurer, Aubrois Véchamboise, she dies from the blood cough. That was the year before the siege, 466 HKC. The sources really emphasize how much she was mourned. By her father, Duke Valcaire, who was the Marshal of the Realm, a huge position, and by Regent Bethrice herself.
And that death introduces someone really important and quite bitter, it seems. Aubrois's daughter, Nimprice.
Yes, Nimprice. The Chronicle paints this picture of her becoming intensely bitter towards the court, developing this open hostility specifically aimed at Bethrice. She actually accused Bethrice of having, quote, stolen her life. Strong words.
Wow. That kind of personal grudge tied to a key family and the Marshal himself. That feels like it's going to cause problems. Did the treasurer position stay stable after Aubrois died?
Not really, no. They appointed another Ventinera, Iofrane, but she was only there briefly. Replaced by late summer 467 in the replacement. Another Ventinera, Tumultuous, but, and this is key, she was from Carolire.
Another connection to the Gwenandoran lands. So you see Bethrice bringing in advisors with ties to her new allies.
It's a clear pattern. And all this is happening while the kingdom is, frankly, broke. The war with Lior had just emptied the treasury. They were deep in debt.
To whom?
The Emetiniari. Think of them as the big banking and merchant families in Chrysalis. Powerful players. The sources show crown gold just pouring towards them. And what did the crown get, or rather give, in return?
Land.
Land, not just loan guarantees.
No, actual land along the Vale and Threum rivers, divided up and granted to Kilniari.
Kilniari, right. The sources call them Swan Knights. From Carolire, Gwenandoran lands, famous for curved blades. Granting them lands seems significant.
It's fundamental. It's not just paying a debt, it's giving away the basis of wealth and power land to foreign warriors, potentially displacing Daconians, definitely angering the traditional landowners like the Ventinari.
So Bethrice's support base is visibly shifting. She's moving away from the old Daconian nobility and the Ventinari towards people connected to Carolire or Daconians who'd served there.
Like those two Toffin brothers mentioned who'd survived an earlier purge, it's a whole realignment of power. And these shifts weren't just confined to the court, were they? They had effects down on the streets of Chrysalis, too.
Yes, that's right. Bethrice started easing up on some of the stricter moral rules, particularly the surveillance of people out at night.
Which created a kind of opening. The sources mention some women, maybe seeking solace or just freedom, were drawn to the Gwenandoran presence. Maybe because they were outside the usual Ventinari rules.
That seems to be the implication. And what's fascinating is how the Gwenandoran handled it. They didn't, push their faith, didn't try to convert anyone. But just them being there, their different customs, it made the Ventinari hierarchy deeply uncomfortable.
So you had Ventinari preachers out on the streets, railing against the Gwenandoran, trying to stir people up. But the common folk in Chrysalis felt differently.
Completely differently. It backfired on the preachers. The ordinary people were just grateful. The Gwenandoran had saved their city from the Lurus. So instead of turning on the Gwenandoran, they turned on the preachers.
Right, there's that amazing anecdote in the Chronicle, isn't there? About the priestess.
Oh yeah, vivid stuff. A Ventinari priestess insults a Gwenandoran female warrior who's walking arm in arm with a Chrysilian woman of the night. And the crowd, laughing, just tosses the priestess into the water at the docks.
That single image tells you so much, doesn't it? About the popular mood, who they saw as saviors, who they resented.
It really highlights the gap between the hierarchy and the people. And that gap, well, it was being noticed and perhaps exploited within the court, which brings us to the matriarch Nades.
She used to be close to Bethrice, the sources say, but clearly something changed. She was running spies inside the royal castle.
And her spies found out something that really set off alarm bells for her. Regent Bethrice was planning to let Gwenandoran settle on Daconia's best farmland, the Golden Fields. Now, for the matriarch, leader of the Ventinari, this wasn't just about land, it was existential.
What did she fear exactly?
She feared Bethrice was aiming to make Daconia a vassal state of the Gwenandoran High Queendom, that she'd convert the whole realm away from the Ventinari faith and basically bring persecution down on the hierarchy.
So she confronted Bethrice directly.
The Chronicle records this, right?
It does. A very tense meeting. The matriarch basically asks, "Are you really going to make us vassals?"
And Beth Rice's answer, it's quite something, according to the source. Very careful.
Very layered, yeah. First, she acknowledges Daconia is, quote, in no position to make such moves, adding for now, which, leaves the door open.
Right. Then she stresses the strategic angle.
Exactly. The need for strong allies against Lior. She points out, hey, the Gwenandoran saved us. Can't forget that. She even makes a point about the enemy king Roichar being Tarosi faith, while Queen Tuslain of the Gwenandoran follows the old ways, the pagan faith. Maybe implying a religious calculation there, too.
And then the sharp part, the sarcasm almost.
Oh, yeah. She basically says, look, if you don't like that the people love the Gwenandoran and hate the Leoris, maybe you should go preach loving the Leoris and hating the Gwenandoran. Adding, almost innocently, that the reason for the current popular feeling is, quote, unknown. A clear dig at the hierarchy being out of touch. Wow. So Beth Rice didn't back down. Did the matriarch take that pointed advice?
Not at all. In 468 HKC, during the big public Sage Viria's Day ceremony, she goes public. Questions why Gair IV, a grown man now, hasn't been given his birthright, why the regency is still going on.
So that's the Ventenary hierarchy openly challenging the Queen Regent in public. Big move.
Huge! And this wasn't just the hierarchy feeling uneasy. Even inside Beth Rice's own family, House Dorazin, there were worries.
Worries about what?
About Daconia falling under Gwenandoran influence, maybe even control. They feared the religious border shifting, from the traditional mountain pass right up to the capital itself.
Okay, so pressure building from multiple sides. Meanwhile, what about Nymphrice, the bitter daughter, wife of the Invisible King?
Yes. The Chronicle details this fascinating, maybe even chilling exchange. Beth Rice, very politely apparently, asks Nymphrice if she still wants out of her marriage. 12 years, loveless, no heir with Gair IV. Does she still want her freedom?
And Nymrice's reaction?
Furious, according to the account. She accuses Beth Rice of only offering this because of that whore Tuslain, Queen Tuslain of the Gwenandoran. Claims Beth Rice doesn't need her anymore now that her mother, Obrois, is dead. And then the threat. She tells Beth Rice, do not forget that my father is the Marshal of the realm.
Pulling the Marshal card, invoking her father's power. And Beth Rice's response to that outburst. Nymrice recounted it later, didn't she?
Yes, and according to Nymrice, Beth Rice was incredibly calm, just said she only wanted Nymrice's happiness, suggested maybe parting ways was logical after 12 years with no heir, and then tells her to go visit Duvaldi Castle and, reflect on her words.
Just ice-cold composure in the face of that fury.
Seems like it. This whole tangle, personal bitterness, religious conflict, political maneuvering, shifting alliances, it all comes to a head in autumn 468 HKC.
Right. Marshal Valcaire Vishambros, Nymrice's father, the man who mourned Abros alongside Beth Rice. He formally brings the question of ending the regency to the royal council.
And he cites the growing pressure from the Ventenary hierarchy, basically validating the matriarch's public challenge. So they call a vote in the council.
And the vote. How'd it go?
The sources state it was close, 3 votes to 2, but the decision was the regency should continue. Beth Rice won the vote.
She won the vote,
Mm-hmm.
but the regency didn't continue, did it?
No. Despite that vote, it ended. Abruptly, shockingly, very soon after.
And this is where the Chronicle gets really dramatic, setting up the core mystery. On the 29th day of the 11th month, 468 HKC.
Beth Rice's body is found in the courtyard below the Tower of Queens. She'd fallen from a window.
Fallen the implication hangs there.
Mm-hmm.
And with the regent dead.
Marshal Valcaire Vishambroise immediately declares the regency over, done. Gair IV, now 27, formally assumes his majority, his right to rule.
But here's a really strange part about Gair IV, isn't it? The profound mystery. His last public sighting was that banquet with the Gwenandoran allies a whole year before.
Exactly. He makes no speech, no proclamation about taking power, issues no decrees, and according to the sources, he was just never seen in public again.
Wow. Just vanishes from view.
He's called the most elusive of Daconian kings. Ruling, if you can even call it that, entirely from behind closed doors. He eventually died, quietly, in the 5th month of 471 HKC.
About 2.5 years after his mother's sudden death and his supposed rise to power.
Yes. And his death immediately raises the succession question again. Who's next? The sources mention names like Raphael Verricarol, Roland Weithofen, other noble lines.
But this is where Marshal Valcaire's timing is. Well, let's just say incredibly convenient. Or strategic.
Extremely telling, yes. Just 7 days before he announces King Gair I is dead, Duke Valcaire makes another announcement.
Which is
That his daughter, Nimrais Gair's bitter widow, is pregnant with child.
7 days before the king's death is announced. Announcing a potential heir right then, that changes everything.
Instantly. Faced with a potential direct heir, the lords of the realm agree to wait. See if the child is born, settle succession then. But to avoid a power vacuum right now, what do? They crown Nimrais, Queen of Daconia in her own right, to rule as regent for her unborn child.
So Gair IV, his legacy is really just being the king who wasn't there, who vanished, leaving behind this kingdom in turmoil, which somehow found a path forward, but really guided by others.
Absolutely. And if you look at what happened next, it's clear who those others were. Marshal Valcaire became the real power behind his daughter Nimrais' throne.
You see his influence right away, don't you?
Clearly. The court keeps trying for that Gwenandoran alliance, but the sources note they're careful now to avoid becoming vassals. Maybe reflecting Valcaire's focus on Daconian independence rather than Bethrais's maybe deeper integration plans.
Possibly. And he consolidates power internally, too.
Yes. He keeps those Kilnieri knights, the ones granted land earlier. He appoints them to administrative roles, specifically replacing Ventenary officials.
So he's continuing that shift away from the old Ventenary power base, even entrenching it.
And he plays the popularity card in the capital. He reverses many of Bethrais's reforms, loosens restrictions on alcohol, on the pleasure houses. The sources say this made him popular with the common folk in Chrysalis, a contrast to the stricter Ventenary, maybe even to Bethrais.
Now, Daconia actually got a bit of a breather from the war with Loyor during Gair's last couple of years, didn't it? Why was that?
Right, because King Roicar of All Loyor had other problems. Lanthair V of Caysdale and Loeros, another powerful kingdom, declared war on him in 467 HKC. Roicar had to shift his focus.
So while Daconia is dealing with its internal drama, the regent's death, the Phantom King, Valcaire's rise Roicar is busy fighting elsewhere.
Exactly. He sends his navy down the lower Uliak River, sends his army, boosted by old Valdi mercenaries, into this region called Baeth, down south.
You're still expanding then.
Oh yes, laying siege to cities in Baeth. 16 apparently fell by force, the rest surrendered. Shows you the scale of his power, his ambition, even while fighting Caysdale.
At that point, Roicar's empire, all Lior, it was huge, wasn't it? The sources say the biggest thing on the continent, Kaela, since way back in the High Kingdom days.
Stretching from New Chrysalis all the way down to the Sea of 100 Islands. Massive.
Yet Roicar himself, despite all that power, remained elusive.
Famously so. Secretive, constantly moving, never settled anywhere for long.
And there's that weird, almost mythical bit in the chronicle about Queen Tisline of the Glenandoran warning Bethrais about Roicar.
Yeah, allegedly warning her that all the powers needed to unite against him, claiming he had some ancient relic.
What kind of relic?
Something that could heal wounds instantly and let him travel super fast between these places called Elven Stones. Ancient magical travel network, maybe?
Wow. Did the sources treat that seriously?
They're careful. They explicitly say it's unknown if it was true or just, Gwenandoran superstition or propaganda. Regardless, maybe the immediate need for Daconia to fully ally with or even submit to the Gwenandoran faded a bit as Roicar got tied up elsewhere and Daconia sorted itself out under Valcaire.
And Roicar, for all his power and maybe magic relics, he wasn't immortal.
Nope. Died in 473 HKC, 78, 79 years old, and the cause. Still a mystery. Secretive in death as in life, the chronicle says.
And his legacy. Not the empire, ironically.
No, his empire didn't last. His chosen successor, Arthane Vivalaci, got assassinated almost immediately. All Lior just fell apart. Chaos. Roicar's generals started carving out their own kingdoms.
More enduring were his books, apparently. On lore, war, statecraft.
Yeah, that's what the sources suggest. The empire collapsed, but the ideas remain.
And the collapse helped Daconia's neighbors.
It did. The new king of Euronia, Daver the Pale, retook Baeth. Caysdale under Lanthair Vibac got back territory north of the Uliak. They picked up the pieces.
It's quite the contrast, isn't it? Mighty Roicar, his empire spanning the continent, only outlives the invisible, impaired King Gair V of weakened Daconia by 2 years.
It really is.
Yeah.
So thinking about why this deep dive into this specific moment matters for you listening today, these sources, they just show so clearly how external threats like Roicar's huge expansion, they don't happen in a vacuum. They massively ramp up the internal pressures.
Absolutely. You see it playing out. The external threat makes the existing political fights worse. The social friction between the Ventenary and the Gwenandoran gets amplified. The financial strain becomes unbearable. It all feeds into each other in a crisis.
And it's a real window into how power works under extreme pressure, how a leader like Bethrice has to make these incredibly tough, potentially alienating choices just to survive, and then how other key figures like the matriarch representing the old ways, or Marshal Valcaire representing a new, maybe more ruthless pragmatism move to protect their own interests, and end up completely redirecting the kingdom.
And amidst all the big history, the sources keep reminding us of the human side. Nimhrice's bitterness is palpable. Bethrice trying to navigate it all with, well, apparent calm. The contrast between those angry street preachers and the grateful common folk throwing one in the docks, those details make it real, relatable somehow.
Yeah, this whole story reveals these timeless things, doesn't it? The constant struggle for power, how foreign policy messes with domestic stability or vice versa, and how individuals, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes manipulating events, can just dramatically change everything, even when the actual king is, well, completely absent from the picture.
So we've traced Daconia through this period of really profound crisis, a kingdom dealing with lost empire led by a complicated regent, making risky alliances, facing internal dissent, all under the shadow of this mysterious unseen king. We saw how these dramatic events, a suspicious death, a confrontation, very calculated political timing, slammed that era shut and started a whole new chapter.
Gair V's story really is unique. The king who just vanished from sight. Left a kingdom in turmoil, sure, but one that found a new way forward, even if it was under perhaps unexpected leadership.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on, based directly on these sources we've discussed. The Royal Council votes explicitly to keep the regency going. Days later, Regent Bethrice is dead. Years pass with an unseen king. Then Gair IV dies, but only after Marshal Valcaire has conveniently announced his own daughter, Nimhrice, is pregnant with the heir, securing his family's claim and her path to the throne. Given that precise sequence from the Chronicles, what might you infer about who the real architects of power and maybe even stability were in Daconia as King Gair V's unseen reign finally came to an end?